Lyanna Stark woke from a nightmare of screams and flashing steel, her mind still trapped in the remnants of the horror that had unfolded at the Tower of Joy. The aching in her body felt like 1,000 knives pressing against her ribs, each one threatening to tear the life from her chest. She turned her head, half expecting to see the tall, stoic figure of Ser Arthur Dayne looming over her, dawn shining cruelly in his hand. Instead, a single candle danced in the corner of the quiet chamber, its weak light casting curved shadows against stone walls. She had never been here before. This was not the Tower of Joy, not the place where she had labored in childbirth and nearly lost her life. Slowly, trembling, she placed her hand upon her stomach and felt the bandaged wound there, as if someone had tried to cut away the life that had just come into this world. Her eyes shuddered shut in memory, but the real terror was not the injuries to her body. It was the fear that her child might have been lost in the carnage. The birth had been excruciating, and in the delirium of fever, she remembered only the swirl of blood and men's voices. Her brother Ned's among them, and the echoing clash of swords felt like a dream. If the child had not survived, it would mean the end of everything. Her heart pounded in her chest, and tears welled up unbidden. She summoned the last of her courage, tried to lift herself, but a new wave of pain pressed her back down on the straw-filled mattress. Soft footsteps approached. Lyanna's eyes fluttered open just as Ned Stark entered, face ashen with worry. He looked thinner than she remembered, his hair matted with sweat. He was still wearing the battered leathers from the fight that had taken place. There was blood on his sleeves. He carried a small bundle, a babe swaddled in rough linen. Lyanna let out a tiny gasp of relief and reached for her son, ignoring the fresh jolt of agony across her ribs. "Lya, you must rest," Ned said quietly. "The maester says you shouldn't try to move so soon." She answered only by outstretching her arms, her breath uneven. "My child," she whispered, her voice ragged with thirst and exhaustion. "Give me my child." Ned's eyes brimmed with tears. He crossed the small room and gently placed the swaddled infant against Lyanna's chest. "He is alive," Ned said in a tone of gentle awe. "7 hells, Lya. I feared for both of you." Lyanna clutched her child, feeling tiny fingers curl against her own. A wave of warmth poured through her. This was life, new and fragile, and hers to protect. If she had died, if the babe had been left alone, it might have all been for nothing. She brushed her lips across the child's forehead, inhaling that newborn scent. She could hardly believe she held him still. "Where are we?" she murmured, glancing around the cramped and simple chamber. The place smelled of herbs and old parchment. A narrow window was cut high into the wall, letting in a sliver of pale daylight. "Near Starfall," Ned replied. "After the fight, there was no choice but to carry you and the boy away. You were so weak. We found an old keep, half abandoned, where a minor lord loyal to father once lived. A few loyal men followed. The rest, they did not survive." Her eyes flickered. "Arthur Dayne," she said. "He nearly killed you." Ned nodded slowly. "He was a legendary swordsman, perhaps the finest in the realm. But in the end, we outnumbered him. He died with dawn in his hand." There was no triumph in his voice, only grief. "I wish there had been another way." Lyanna closed her eyes. She had once thought Arthur Dayne an honorable knight, a man who served Rhaegar Targaryen and the Kingsguard vow with unwavering loyalty. It seemed an age ago that she had danced at the tourney at Harrenhal, a free-spirited young woman with flowers in her hair and a stubborn heart. Now she lay half-broken in a cold chamber, her only comfort the fragile infant at her breast. "And Rhaegar?" Ned's face hardened. He fell on the trident. Robert crushed his breastplate with a warhammer blow. His mouth pressed into a grim line. "It's over, Lya. House Targaryen is destroyed. The war is done. Robert sits the throne." She bowed her head, heart pounding. Perhaps it should have comforted her that the war ended, that the realm would find some semblance of peace. But it did not. Peace would never exist for her son if Robert Baratheon discovered his existence. Rhaegar's son. The child's dark hair hinted at the Stark lineage, but she knew the truth. The blood of the dragon still ran in those tiny veins, and Robert would never suffer the life of Rhaegar's heir. "He can never know," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "If Robert learns this child is Rhaegar's blood, the boy will be put to the sword." She stared into Ned's eyes, beseeching him to understand. "Swear to me, Ned. Swear you will protect him." Ned's eyes glistened. His voice caught. "Lya, it's the same vow you asked of me before you lost consciousness," he said. "I gave you my word then, and I give it again now. I swear on my life." She nodded slowly, pressing her lips to the babe's head. His small face was perfect, and when he opened his eyes, she saw the faintest flicker of gray, a hint of Stark. Perhaps that would be enough to save him. But she had no illusions. If Robert saw anything Targaryen in him, he would kill the child. Robert's hatred for Rhaegar burned hotter than wildfire. The day they were strong enough to travel, Ned tried to convince Lyanna to remain behind, to let him claim the boy as his own bastard, while she returned quietly to Winterfell, where no one would suspect a child had come from her womb. The war had ended, but the realm was still reeling, and rumors abounded. Ned insisted that this was the only way, that the world must believe the boy Jon, they named him, was Ned Stark's bastard, mothered by some camp follower or fisher girl. Lyanna, however, refused to be parted from her son. She argued, fiercely and unexpectedly for a woman so close to death, that she alone must keep him safe. She would not trust rumor and subterfuge to shield her baby from Robert's wrath. If Robert learned or even suspected that Lyanna Stark had given birth to Rhaegar's child, it would spark deeper questions, more dangerous scrutiny. But if she disappeared, and her child was raised in secret somewhere in the north, that might be the best chance. Ned recognized the same fierce resolve he had seen in his sister from childhood. The brash girl who had once bested Benjen in a sword fight, who had raced horses with the stable boys and refused to be tamed by ladies' gentle arts. Her love for her son was an unbreakable bond. Ned saw that if he forced her, he would break something within her that might never mend. And so he sat with her for hours, the two siblings planning quietly by the light of a single candle. In the end, they forged a perilous plan. They would return to Winterfell together. Ned would say nothing of the boy's father. He would offer only that he had fathered a bastard while fighting in the war, an act of dishonor he would bear in silence. As for Lyanna, rumors would say she had been imprisoned by Rhaegar and found near death by Ned. The entire truth that she had borne a child by Rhaegar would stay hidden. To the world, she was merely a young woman who had nearly died in captivity. But in the privacy of the north, behind the gray walls of Winterfell, Lyanna Stark would watch over her son and raise him as best she could, always mindful that the slightest whisper could reach King Robert's ears. If that happened, no measure of brotherly love would save them. They rode north with a small escort, hearts heavy with secrets. The day they crossed the neck, Lyanna smelled the damp pine and the cold wind cutting across the marshes. She recalled the old childhood sensations of home, the hush of snow falling on bare branches, the howling of the winter winds under the eaves. She felt a pang of nostalgic grief, remembering a time when her greatest worry was outrunning her brothers in the courtyard. She clung to the babe swaddled in her arms, determined that he, too, would come to love the North as she did. If her life had taught her anything, it was that duty, honor, and love often did not align, but that the greatest kindness was to protect the innocent from the cruelties of men. When the Stark party at last arrived at Winterfell, half the castle turned out to greet Lord Eddard's triumphant return, though it was a subdued triumph. King Robert had taken the Iron Throne, and House Stark had done its duty, but Ned and Lyanna were not in a celebratory mood. Lyanna's face was pale and drawn, her cheeks hollow from the trials of war and childbirth. She held her son close, ignoring the curious looks from the guardsmen and servants. She met her father's gaze. Lord Rickard Stark had been executed by Aerys Targaryen, so he was gone. It was instead old Nan's eyes that shone with astonishment to see Lyanna alive. Bran and Rickon did not yet exist in this timeline. Instead, it was Benjen Stark, the youngest brother, who was there, tears glistening as he embraced Lyanna. Despite everything, they felt a moment of warmth. Lyanna was home, and so was the baby. The news spread quickly throughout the castle that Ned had returned from war with a bastard son, little Jon Snow. Lyanna was also back, rescued from Targaryen captivity, frail but alive. Whispers abounded among the servants, and though none dared speak so openly in front of the Starks, the name Ash-Era Dayne floated through the corridors as a rumored mother of Ned's child. People remembered how Ned had once danced with the Lady of Starfall at Harrenhal. That rumor Ned allowed to fester. Better they gossip about him than about Lyanna's suspiciously protective posture around the child. Robert Baratheon visited only once that first winter, riding north in a wave of boisterous laughter and ale-laden festivities. He embraced Ned, tried to charm Lyanna with boorish jokes, but she offered only polite smiles and did not linger in his presence. The old betrothal between them, once so hopeful, was a memory turned sour by war and death. Robert took one look at baby Jon and laughed, slapping Ned on the back. "You dog! I never knew you had it in you." He treated the boy as a curiosity, never suspecting that the child might be Rhaegar's. Lyanna, heart-pounding, took pains to ensure that Robert and Jon were never alone together for more than a few heartbeats. She never wanted to risk the king noticing some flicker of Targaryen in the boy. But Jon's hair was dark, and his eyes had cooled from newborn gray to the deep darkness of nights in the north, close enough to a stark color that the king had no reason for suspicion. That winter was brutal, though short. In Winterfell's crypts, Lyanna often wandered. She visited her own memorial statue, carved by a stonemason who had believed her dead. Standing before that cold marble effigy, she felt an eerie sense that part of her truly had died in the Tower of Joy. She vowed that the woman she had been, the carefree girl who sang to the weirwood trees, was gone. In her place stood a mother, solemn and fierce. She resolved that her entire life would revolve around safeguarding Jon's future, even if that meant living in quiet anonymity within these gray walls for the rest of her days. As Jon grew, toddling about Winterfell's courtyards, Lyanna taught him the ways of the north. She showed him how to place a hand on the old weirwood tree and feel the heartbeat of the ancient gods. She taught him to say "Yes, my lord" to Ned in the Great Hall, to show respect to the soldiers who guarded the gates. She brushed his thick, dark hair in the mornings, gazing into his curious eyes. Many said he looked like Ned. No one guessed it was the ghost of Rhaegar's Targaryen blood shining in him. And if, in moments of quiet, Lyanna saw the flicker of a silver sheen in his hair under certain lights, she told herself it was only a trick of the sun. Ned proved a second father to Jon in many ways. Despite the burden of secrecy, Ned found he loved the boy dearly. He would hold Jon's hand in the yard and teach him the rudiments of swordsmanship, using a small wooden practice sword. "Keep your shoulders square," Ned would say in that calm, deep voice. "Aim for the heart, but don't forget to guard your own." Jon took to the lessons eagerly, though he often looked up to Lyanna for approval. And she would stand on the sideline, her heart swelling with pride. She was grateful to Ned for bearing the shame of fatherhood that was not truly his, for standing between her son and 1,000 sharp eyes. But neither Ned nor Lyanna could protect Jon from the casual cruelty of those who whispered behind his back. Some of the older squires teased him for his bastard name. Jon, still too young to fully understand, merely frowned. Once, after hearing taunts that "you have no real mother," Jon, with tears in his eyes, ran to the godswood. Lyanna found him there, small fists clenched, trembling from anger and confusion. She knelt and gathered him in her arms, pressing her cheek to his dark curls. "I am your mother," she said in a hushed, determined voice. "I will always be your mother. The rest, it doesn't matter, Jon." He looked up at her with wide eyes. "Why do they say I'm a bastard?" She pressed her lips together, searching for a gentle lie that could soothe him without unraveling the fragile tapestry of secrecy. "The world can be cruel, but you are loved, Jon. You are stark enough." That was all she could offer, though a burning shame and anger welled inside her that her child must face the scorn. She couldn't reveal the truth. That truth would see him killed. When Jon was old enough to speak more clearly, he asked about his father. Ned had told him he was the father, but Jon saw how Lord Stark had other children: Robb, born of Lady Catelyn Tully, then Sansa, Arya, Bran, Rickon. Jon's place in the family seemed uncertain. Lyanna, torn between the urge to lie and the urge to speak honestly, found a compromise. "Your father loves you, Jon," she would say, brushing back the hair from his forehead. "And your mother will never leave you." A pang of guilt stung her tongue every time she withheld the full truth. But she reminded herself that the cost of honesty might be the boy's life. She prayed the old gods would forgive her. Time moved on. The shadows of war receded from Westeros, though new conflicts always arose, as they do. The Greyjoy rebellion came and went, and rumors abounded from King's Landing about the Lannisters' growing influence. Through it all, Winterfell stood resolute, and Lyanna devoted herself to raising Jon, carefully guiding him to be strong, honorable, and wise. She encouraged him to watch Ned's example, to listen to old Nan's stories of the North's harsh winters and the resilience of the Starks. She wanted him to grow up with the sense that he belonged here, that Winterfell was his sanctuary. If the day ever came when his father's name would matter, she wanted him to have deep roots that would keep him steady. When Jon was 8, he raced Robb through the Bailey in a swirl of fresh-falling snow. Lyanna stood on the ramparts, arms folded, smiling to see the easy friendship between the two boys. Robb had been told that Jon was his half-brother, and with a child's simplicity, he accepted it. They laughed together, wrestled in the yard, shared a bed at times if one was scared of a thunderstorm. The sight made Lyanna's heart ache with joy and worry. She knew that as they aged, the differences between them, Robb the heir, Jon the bastard, would grow starker. One day, she feared, the question of legitimacy might gnaw at Jon's sense of self. She prayed that, by then, her love and Ned's guidance would be enough to anchor him. That night, as snowdrifts piled in the corners of the courtyard, Lyanna lit a lantern and made her way to Ned's solar, leaving Jon asleep in his small bedchamber. She found her brother poring over letters, looking weary. Lines had formed at the corners of his eyes, and streaks of silver threaded his dark hair. War and the burdens of lordship had aged him, but he was still kind, still the quiet rock upon which Winterfell stood. He glanced up. "Lyanna, is something the matter?" She shut the door behind her, setting the lantern on the desk. "I've been thinking about telling Jon a portion of the truth, enough to keep him from feeling lost." She hesitated, aware that each word was a step along a dangerous path. "I cannot bear his doubts, Ned." His expression grew serious. "You know the risk." She nodded. "But if he grows to resent us or question our love, that risk is also dire. Secrets can corrode the soul. I'm his mother. I'd do anything to protect him, but I can't bear to see him so uncertain." Ned pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. "We agreed, Lya. If the truth spreads beyond these walls, Robert would." She bowed her head. "I know," she murmured. "I would never reveal Rhaegar's name, but telling Jon that I am truly his mother might not endanger him. The realm believes I nearly died in captivity. If we say that in my captivity, I bore a child, yours in name, to keep him safe, would that spark rumors?" Ned exhaled, shoulders sagging. "Perhaps not, so long as Jon tells no one else. He's only a boy, but he's not a fool. If he learns you are his mother, he may ask after his father." She smiled wryly. "I'll tell him his father is gone, a casualty of war. Let him think I was forced, that it was shameful. Whatever falsehood is needed to keep him safe. He need not know he's a Targaryen. Better he never hears that name." Ned was silent for a long moment. "Do as you feel is best," he said at last. "You're right that he deserves a sense of belonging. I'll support whatever you decide." That night, Lyanna slipped into Jon's chamber. He was half awake, blinking in the torchlight. "Mother?" he asked, that single word so simple, so natural. She realized he had never once called her that aloud, always hearing her addressed as "my lady" or "Aunt Lya" by the others. But she craved the word "mother" on his lips. She sank onto the edge of his bed, her heart twisting with anticipation. "Jon, I have to tell you something important. You know I love you, don't you?" He nodded, eyes wide. "I know," he whispered. "Sometimes I'm scared you'll leave or that father will send me away. But you always come." She felt tears gather. Carefully, she took his small hand in hers. "Jon, listen. I am your mother by blood. You were born to me here in the north, well, not exactly here, but to me. Lord Stark, Ned, he raised you as his own for your protection. We told everyone else that he was your father. But in truth, I am the one who gave birth to you. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Jon's eyes searched hers, uncertain. "But you never said so before. Why would you hide that?" She swallowed, trying to keep her voice steady. "There are dangerous people in this world who would want to hurt us if they knew. It's been safer for us to let people believe Lord Stark is your only parent. But I don't want you to feel alone. I want you to know that you came from me, that I wanted you, loved you, fought for you." He was quiet for a long time, staring at the blanket. Then he reached out and wrapped his arms around her neck, pressing his face against her shoulder. She held him, stroking his hair as tears slipped down her cheeks, relief flooding her. It felt as though a barrier had shattered, the lie that had kept them from fully embracing their bond. Jon sniffed, voice muffled. I love you, mother." He tested the word with trembling uncertainty. "But who was my father?" She closed her eyes. "He's gone, my sweet boy. A man from the south. A man I cannot name. He was taken by the war. That's all I can say." It pained her to watch confusion shadow Jon's face, but she pressed on. "I promise you, I'll never leave you as long as I live. You belong here in Winterfell with me." Jon nodded slowly, still clinging to her. She felt his tears, warm against her neck. He was only 8 years old, and the weight of half-truths and secrets pressed down on him already. But he was strong, he always had been. He had to be in this world that spared no one. Lyanna kissed the top of his head and stroked his hair. Whatever storms came, she would stand between them and her son. From that day forward, an unspoken shift took place. In public, Jon still called her Aunt Lyanna, at Ned's urging, to avoid stirring suspicion. But in private, mother and son leaned on each other more openly. Lyanna would sneak into the library tower with Jon, reading him tales of old heroes, Serwyn of the Mirror Shield, Brandon the Builder, even King Aegon the Conqueror's journey across the sea, though she carefully avoided mention of Targaryens. Jon loved the story of how the Night's Watch once faced down armies of the dead and the others, how the North survived through unity. He was enthralled by these ancient legends, his face alight with curiosity. Sometimes, she caught a glimpse of a fire in his eyes that reminded her of Rhaegar's passion for prophecy. She steeled herself, burying that memory. That part of Jon's heritage was a secret too perilous to ever reveal. Seasons passed. The children of Winterfell grew into gangly youths. Robb and Jon sparred together in the yard, each one pushing the other to excel. Sansa and Arya practiced sewing under their mother Catelyn's guidance. Bran toddled after them, while Rickon remained an infant. Through it all, Lyanna played the role of the quiet aunt, overshadowed by Catelyn's official status as Lady Stark. This was not a problem for Lyanna. She preferred solitude to the pomp of courtly life. She spent her days riding through the Wolfswood with a small guard, hawking with her falcons, or simply walking the ramparts at dawn, letting the icy wind remind her she was alive and free. But one crisp autumn day, King Robert arrived at Winterfell with a grand retinue. The gates swelled with the sight of the royal party, and rumor flew that Robert intended to name Ned as Hand of the King. Lyanna's heart pounded in her chest when she saw the Lannisters among the visitors, particularly Queen Cersei, with her golden hair and cunning smile. Jaime Lannister's face was blank as he surveyed Winterfell, while Tyrion Lannister walked with curiosity, his mismatched eyes taking in every detail. Most troubling was the presence of Varys the Spider. He was not part of the official retinue, but word had it that he sometimes traveled to gather intelligence. Lyanna feared that the webs of King's Landing might stretch further than she had ever guessed. Robert greeted Ned boisterously in the courtyard, slamming him into a bear hug. Then he spotted Lyanna, standing quietly by the steps. He rushed over, arms open. "My sweet Lyanna, It warms my heart to see you well." He tried to embrace her, but she offered a delicate tilt of her head instead, stepping back just out of reach. Robert blinked, a flicker of hurt crossing his features, but quickly masked it with laughter. "Still the wild she-wolf, eh? Fair enough, fair enough." She smiled a thin smile, her voice carefully polite. "You're most welcome, Your Grace." She glanced behind him, her gaze flickering. "We are honored by your presence." Robert's boisterous demeanor took up all the space in the courtyard. Before the courtiers could disperse, Robert's eyes fell on Jon, who stood near the stables. The boy had grown lean and agile from sword practice. His hair was that thick, dark shade of midnight. He was watching the king with guarded curiosity. Well, your bastard has grown, Ned," Robert roared, gesturing for Jon to come forward. "Come here, lad. Let me have a look at you." Jon glanced uncertainly at Ned, who nodded. The boy approached, dipping his head respectfully. "Your Grace." Robert studied him. He's got the look of the North about him. The bastard name suits him less than I'd have thought. He's as comely as any young lord." Robert's gaze slid over to Lyanna. "And you, Lya, does the sight of this boy stir your maternal instincts? Perhaps you've helped raise him? I know you have a soft heart." Lyanna forced a grin. "Jon is dear to me, Your Grace. He's like a son in many ways." Her eyes flickered to Ned, but she held Robert's gaze calmly, as though there were no deeper meaning in her words. Robert smirked, perhaps a little drunken already from a wineskin on the road. Good, so long as he knows his place." His joviality returned, and he turned away, clapping Ned on the shoulder. "Now, enough standing around in the cold. I need ale, a hot meal, and a soft bed." That night, the great hall was filled with music and laughter. Lyanna found her seat among the Starks, the hustle of servants and knights swirling around them. Jon was placed at the far side of the table, near the bastards and lesser wards, a subtle reminder of his low status. She caught his eye across the feast, offering a faint smile. He returned it gratefully, ignoring the jibes of some of Robert's courtiers. The tension in Lyanna's chest did not subside, especially as she noticed Varys gliding through the hall, talking quietly with lords and ladies, gathering rumors like a spider collecting strands of silk. She steeled her expression, refusing to show fear, even as she knew that the slightest slip, the slightest rumor could give away Jon's parentage. She dreaded the day any of them discovered the truth, that the boy was not merely Ned's bastard, but the trueborn son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. As the night wore on and the hall grew hot with bodies and torches, Lyanna slipped out to the Godswood. There, she found Jon already waiting, standing by the black pool beneath the heart tree. He turned upon hearing her footsteps. The moonlight etched his features into pale lines of worry. "Mother," he said quietly, stepping into her embrace. She held him close. She knew they took a risk even letting him call her that in private. But the Godswood was deserted at this hour. "Are you all right?" she asked, stroking his hair. He swallowed. "I don't like this king. He's loud, and he stares at me oddly, like he's trying to see inside me." She suppressed a shiver. "Robert hates Targaryens. He hated Rhaegar above all. But as long as he believes Ned is your father, you're safe." She cupped Jon's face, searching his eyes. "We must be cautious, Jon. These courtiers, they delight in secrets. If you ever hear any questions about your parentage, come to me at once." Jon nodded, his jaw firming. He was only a boy of 14, but there was a quiet strength in him that belied his youth. She recognized that core of honor, which seemed to run as true as steel in the Stark blood. He might not be Ned's son, but he was a Stark through her, and it showed. In the days that followed, the king busied himself with hunts in the Wolfswood, tours of the Winterfell crypts, and hours of boozing and feasting that left him staggering. Lyanna avoided his company whenever possible. She had known him as a young man, brash but charming, and once believed she might have found love with him. But that was a lifetime ago. Now he was a bitter, bloated shell of that man, and she had no patience for his jests or the weight of his scrutiny. One evening, As the court gathered for a boar hunt the next day, Robert cornered Lyanna near the library tower. He was red-faced with drink. "Why do you skulk away, Lya? Do you hate me so much now?" She bristled. "I do not hate you, Robert, but we are not the same as we were. The war changed many things." He made a half-laugh, half-snarl. It did. Took you from me. It took Rhaegar's life. It gave me this damned crown. But the realm is better for it, don't you see? A Targaryen on the throne would have been a disaster. That line is cursed. You're lucky I saved you from him." Lyanna felt anger flash in her eyes. She remembered Rhaegar differently, though she could not speak of it. Instead, she simply said, "You saved me from many things, Robert, but we can't turn back time." He exhaled heavily, leaning against a stone pillar. "Come south with us. Let old wounds heal. You're still beautiful, and I remember your laughter like it was yesterday." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away smoothly. "My place is in the north," she said. "Thank you for the invitation, Your Grace." His eyes narrowed, and for a moment she saw the dangerous flicker that had ended Rhaegar Targaryen's life at the Trident. She felt her heart skip. But Robert merely laughed, a hollow sound. "So be it," he said, turning on his heel. As he walked away, he threw over his shoulder, "Better a wolf than a dragon, I suppose." She stood there, trembling with anger she dared not express. She could not forget the times Rhaegar had whispered songs in her ear, the gentleness in his touch, how he had insisted that their child might be the promised prince. She also knew his flaws. He had lit the spark that led to war, he had abandoned Elia Martell, and perhaps he had been blinded by prophecy. But she loved him still, in some secret corner of her heart, and she saw no redemption in Robert's bitterness. Soon after, Robert and his retinue rode south, leaving Ned behind as Hand of the King. The departure of the king lightened Winterfell's mood, but a pall remained. Ned and Catelyn prepared to journey to King's Landing, taking Sansa and Arya with them. Robb would remain behind with Lyanna and the younger boys. Jon wanted to join the Night's Watch, a boyhood dream of glory and escape from the stigma of bastardy. Lyanna felt her chest tighten at the thought. To lose him to the Wall, a place for criminals and cast-offs, seemed wrong. But she also knew there was honor in the Watch, and that her father's brother, Benjen Stark, had chosen it. Perhaps it was the safest path for Jon. Far from King Robert's eyes, beyond the concerns of lineage and inheritance. Yet she also suspected that Jon's potential, his leadership, his courage, could serve a greater purpose in the realm. When the day came for Ned's departure, the courtyard was chaos with horses, wagons, and the bustle of servants. Lyanna embraced her brother, the siblings exchanging a look that carried more meaning than 1,000 words. He rested a hand on her shoulder. "Keep Jon close. If events in King's Landing grow dangerous, I'll send word." She nodded, hugging him. "Be safe, Ned." She glanced at the girls. Sansa looked eager for courtly life. Arya looked furious at the prospect. "Watch over them." With that, Ned rode south and Winterfell changed again. The Greyjoy wards, Theon among them, prowled around. Robb grew into the role of young lord, training with the Master-at-Arms, Roderick Castle. Lyanna watched from the sidelines, her concern never far from Jon. He was the quiet one, always thinking, always weighing the world's judgments upon his shoulders. She tried to reassure him that he was valued, that he was her son and she was proud. But there was a longing in Jon for answers. She could sense it, the way he sometimes stared into the fire as though seeking shapes in the flames. On a bright morning soon after Ned's departure, she found Jon in the Godswood, staring at his reflection in the black pool. She placed a hand on his shoulder. He startled slightly. "Mother," he said, exhaling. "Sometimes I look at my face and wonder if I see a stranger." Her heart tensed. "You are not a stranger to me. I see my own eyes in yours, Jon." He swallowed, turning to meet her gaze. "Is that all? A piece of you? Who was the man that gave me the rest? Am I cursed to never know that half of me?" She sighed. "I told you all I can. He was gone before you even drew breath. He died in that war. If it hadn't happened, You'd have grown up in shame and secrecy anyway. Because Robert... She bit her tongue. She was dangerously close to revealing too much. Because the realm is not kind to children born outside of marriage, she finished, her voice subdued. Jon nodded, bitter lines etched in his features. So I have no name but Snow? She heard the anger, the longing. She remembered Rhaegar's ideals, the songs he played on his silver-stringed harp, the belief in a better world. Gently, she drew Jon into an embrace. You have my name, Stark, flowing in your blood. Even if the world does not call you by it, you are my son, a Stark of Winterfell. She paused, lifting his chin so their eyes met. And that is worth far more than any piece of paper. Though tears shone in his eyes, Jon managed a small smile. You sound just like Uncle Ned. She shook her head. I speak from a mother's heart. Child, you are strong and good. Don't ever doubt your worth. Time slipped by in the steady rhythm of northern life. Hunts, feasts, harsh winters, fleeting summers. The letters from King's Landing grew dire. Ned wrote of Lannister schemes, of tensions with the crown, of an investigation into Jon Arryn's death. Then the Ravens announced Ned's imprisonment, the rise of Joffrey Baratheon, and war. Robb Stark, still not a man grown but now the Lord of Winterfell, called the bannermen to march south. Lyanna watched with dread, recalling the nightmares of the last great war. She felt the old terror for Jon, for Ned, and for the North. She wanted to ride beside Robb as he marched, but she also knew her place was with Jon, to protect him from the chaos that war might bring. As the War of the Five Kings erupted, the North declared independence under King Robb. Lyanna's heart clenched at the news that Ned was executed on the steps of the Great September in King's Landing. She had lost her brother, her shield, her best friend. She wept bitterly, but in private. Jon stood beside her, silent in his own heartbreak. He had never truly known Ned as his father, but Ned had been a strong, guiding figure all the same. His loss was devastating to them both. In the following months, everything shifted. Robb was away at war. Letters came rarely, each bearing tidings of battles won or lost. The swirl of politics threatened to tear the realm apart. Lady Catelyn returned to Winterfell briefly, only to depart again in the name of peace. And amid it all, Theon Greyjoy betrayed the Starks, sacking Winterfell and capturing Bran and Rickon. The castle fell into chaos. Lyanna and Jon found themselves in mortal danger when Theon's men roamed the corridors. On the night that Theon's Ironborn took the Great Keep, Lyanna and Jon hid in a narrow passage behind the hearth in a deserted storeroom. Jon had outgrown his childhood innocence, now nearly a man at 17. He carried a sword at his belt, though he had never used it in true battle. Lyanna clutched a dagger. They breathed softly in the dark, hearing shouts and the ring of steel. She remembered how she had once hidden from Rhaegar's enemies, terrified and alone. Now she was in that position again, but this time she had her son. She refused to let him be taken. When the footsteps died down, Jon carefully moved aside the hidden panel. They slipped out, creeping through the shadows of the hall until they came upon a group of frightened servants. Together, they fled into the Godswood. Theon had sealed the gates, but Hodder, the friendly giant of a stable boy, managed to pry open an old sally port, enabling a small group to escape into the night. Lyanna stayed close to Jon, her pulse hammering. She did not know where to go or how to survive. But she was not that young girl anymore. She was a mother who had endured nightmares for the sake of her child. They found refuge among the northern clans. Word spread that Winterfell was in flames, that Bran and Rickon were supposedly dead, that Robb Stark was off fighting in the south. Lyanna nearly collapsed from grief, but Jon kept her going, his arm around her as they traveled the lonely roads. Despair threatened to crush her. They had lost everything: Ned, the castle, their sense of security. Yet as they huddled in a small cabin in the hills near the Umbers, Lyanna realized something. Despite it all, Jon was still alive, still at her side. She would fight for him until her last breath. Eventually, news reached them that Robb Stark, the king in the north, had met betrayal at the Twins. The Red Wedding, Another savage blow that left them reeling. The north was shattered, the great houses in disarray. She and Jon moved carefully from one sympathetic household to another, never staying in one place long. House Mormont gave them brief shelter on Bear Island, Lady Meage Mormont welcoming them grimly. The stories of the War of the Five Kings were overshadowed by rumors of White Walkers in the far north, talk of black magic stirring beyond the wall. Lyanna felt a sense of foreboding, recalling old stories of ice demons and the long night. In the face of such horrors, the petty wars of men seemed trivial. But men's wars had cost her family dearly, and she could not ignore them. She weighed her options, thinking of how best to protect Jon. Perhaps the safest place now was indeed the Wall, where the ancient vows of the Night's Watch might shield him from southern politics. Jon, meanwhile, had grown increasingly resolute, speaking often of wanting to join his uncle Benjen, if Benjen yet lived. He knew the realm was in turmoil, and he wanted to do something meaningful rather than hide. At last, mother and son made their way to Castle Black. The journey was arduous. Storms and bitter cold battered them, but Lyanna pressed on, her jaw set. She recalled that final vow from Ned, that he would do anything to keep Jon safe. Now Ned was gone, and the responsibility lay on her shoulders alone. At Castle Black, they found the Night's Watch battered by recent events, but still holding the line against the growing threat from beyond the wall. Jon sought the permission of the acting Lord Commander to take the Black, an unprecedented request for a woman's alleged bastard. Lyanna wanted to speak on his behalf, but Jon insisted on doing so himself. He knelt before the old bear, Lord Commander Jeor Mormont, in the candlelit chamber of the Lord Commander's tower. Lyanna stood by, her heart pounding. Jon told Mormont he wished to join the Night's Watch, that he was skilled with a sword, that he had the blood of the North in his veins, and that he would serve with honor until his dying day. Mormont studied him gravely, glancing at Lyanna with a hint of surprise. He had heard rumors that she was Ned Stark's sister, but he had not expected her to be here personally. "What do you say, Lady Stark?" Mormont asked, tugging on his thick white beard. Lyanna squared her shoulders. "I will let my son make his own choices, Lord Commander. But I ask that you protect him as you would any of your men. He is strong and he will be loyal. The realm is in need of men like him, men of honor." Jon bowed his head. "I have little else to offer but my sword and my life." Mormont nodded, something like approval in his eyes. "The Watch is always in need of good men." He took a moment, as though weighing deeper matters. "Word has reached us of troubles far beyond the usual scope of wildlings. Darkness gathers, the White Walkers stir. It's no time for petty distinctions of birth. If you would swear the oath, then do so." And so, under the cold gray sky in the courtyard of Castle Black, Jon Snow placed his hand on the ancient weirwood stump and spoke the words that would bind him. "Night gathers, and now my watch begins." Lyanna stood at the edge of the courtyard, tears glistening in her eyes. She watched the boy she had cradled in her arms at the Tower of Joy become a man of the Night's Watch, forging his own path in a world fraught with peril. There was sadness in her heart that he would never wed, never father children, never claim lands or titles. But she also felt a strange sense of relief. In the Watch, Jon might find purpose and respect, free of the endless judgments of bastardy or the risk that someone might uncover his Targaryen blood. After the ceremony, she embraced him in the courtyard. The wind whipped through their cloaks, and the smell of ice filled her nostrils. She tried to speak, but emotion choked her voice. Jon hugged her back tightly, his breath hot against her cheek in the freezing air. "Mother," he said, voice trembling, "this isn't goodbye forever. I'll see you when you pass by Castle Black again, or if you ever need me." She bit her lip. "I know. I'm so proud of you." She pressed her forehead against his. "There's a greatness in you, Jon. Never doubt that. You are my son." He blinked tears away, nodding. "I won't forget." She parted from him that evening, heartbroken yet resolute. She lingered at Castle Black a while longer, talking with Mormont and others, hearing of the encroaching threat from beyond the wall. They spoke of old prophecies, of the king beyond the wall, Mance Raider, gathering wildlings, of things more sinister lurking in the far north. Lyanna felt an ancient dread stirring, as though the realm was on the cusp of a new war, one far more terrifying than any that had come before. She felt, too, that Jon might have a role to play in the battles ahead. Rhaegar had believed in a prophecy about a prince who was promised, a champion of light. But that talk was better left buried, for prophecy was as dangerous as wildfire. When she finally departed Castle Black, leaving Jon behind in his black cloak, she rode south alone through the Wolfswood, uncertain where her path would lead. War still raged, the Stark forces scattered. She considered heading toward the Vale, perhaps seeking refuge with House Arryn, or traveling to White Harbor to the Manderleys. Winterfell was a ruin held by Bolton or Greyjoy or some other turncloak. She had no taste for the south. King's Landing was a pit of vipers. So she turned her horse east, letting the crisp northern wind guide her. Snow fell in lazy spirals, dusting the pines in white. She recalled the illusions of youth, the laughter and the heartbreak that had led her to flee with Rhaegar. She recalled the price she had paid for love, and the oath she had forced Ned to swear. She did not regret a moment, for she still had Jon, and he lived. That was enough. Her journey was lonely. In village inns, she heard whispers of kings dying, of fresh battles, of Lannister brutality, of Stark vengeance. She heard rumors of a red-haired girl escaping King's Landing, of a boy claiming to be Rickon Stark, of wildlings breaching the wall. The realm was chaos incarnate, as though the gods themselves had abandoned all sense. At a certain point, she found shelter in a small holdfast near the Shivering Sea, where she spent a bitterly cold winter. In her quiet hours, she prayed. She prayed for Jon's safety among the Black Brothers, for an end to the never-ending bloodshed. She prayed for the memory of Ned and for the children lost in the storms of war. One night, sitting by a meager fire, Lyanna found herself thinking of Rhaegar again, remembering the gentleness in his voice when he spoke of their child. She let herself imagine a world where he had survived, where Robert had not. In that world, perhaps their son would have been openly named a prince, uniting the North and the Targaryen line in peace. But the real world was far harsher. The old Targaryen sigil was a cursed banner, and that secret still lay buried in Jon's blood. Years crept on. The war hammered the Seven Kingdoms mercilessly, forging new alliances, toppling old houses. Tales reached Lyanna of Jon's rising fame in the Night's Watch, how he had gone beyond the wall, met with wildlings, faced great terrors in the frozen wastes, and returned changed. She ached to see him, but was tied down by the realities of travel in a fractured realm. When at last winter broke, or at least relented enough for travel, Lyanna made the arduous journey back to Castle Black. She found the Watch in a state of upheaval, Black brothers running to and fro, fortifications being repaired. She was met with cautious respect, for Jon had spoken of his mother as a Stark, though few men truly grasped the significance. They merely knew she was Ned Stark's sister. Upon asking for Jon, she was directed to the Lord Commander's solar. Lord Commander? The words rang strangely in her ears. Surely Jeor Mormont still held that post. But as she passed men in the courtyard, she heard them address Jon as Lord Commander Snow. She almost didn't believe her ears. Could it be true? The boy she had cradled at the Tower of Joy, the bastard overshadowed by 1,000 secrets, was now Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Her heart swelled with pride and fear. If he commanded the Watch, the eyes of the realm would be upon him in ways that might resurrect the old ghost of his true parentage. But she told herself that the world was different now. Another Targaryen had risen in Essos, Daenerys Stormborn, carrying dragons, if the rumors were to be believed. Perhaps the realm's hatred for Targaryens would be overshadowed by the threat of the others. Or perhaps it would not matter. Perhaps Jon had found his calling, and that was all there was to it. She climbed the icy steps to the Lord Commander's tower. 2 Black brothers stood guard, but upon seeing her stark features, they let her pass without question. In the solar, Jon stood hunched over a map with several senior officers. He wore the thick cloak of the Watch, a cloak lined with wolf fur. His face was older, a faint scar on his cheek, his eyes haunted yet determined. Lyanna's chest constricted at the sight of him, all grown into a man. She cleared her throat softly, and he looked up. "Mother," he said quietly, stepping away from the table. The officers discreetly exited, bowing their heads at Lyanna as they passed. Jon approached, hesitating a moment before pulling her into a fierce embrace. She felt his warmth, smelled the cold wind in his hair, and realized with a pang that he was taller than her now, broader. "I heard rumors," she said, her hand on his cheek, voice trembling. "Lord Commander of the Night's Watch?" He gave a small, humble nod. "It happened quickly. Mormont was killed beyond the wall, by mutineers at Craster's Keep. There were difficulties. When I returned, certain events led to me being chosen. I never sought this." She could see the weight in his eyes. "But you bear it because it's your duty," she said softly, pride shining through her tears. He exhaled shakily. "The wall faces grave threats, Mother. The White Walkers are real. I've seen them with my own eyes. And unless the realm unites, we are doomed." She glanced at the map. Marks indicated wildling positions, walker sightings, potential strongholds. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Then I will stay and do what I can to help," she said, surprising even herself. Perhaps she had always thought of the watch as Jon's domain, not hers. But she realized she had nowhere else to go, no castle to call home. Winterfell was still in Bolton hands, last she heard, or perhaps retaken by Starks. Rumors were inconsistent. She only knew that here, at the wall, she was near her son, near the last shred of her family. In the weeks that followed, Lyanna lived as a sort of honored guest at Castle Black, quietly assisting in small ways, caring for the wounded, writing letters appealing to northern lords for aid. She watched Jon lead with a mixture of fierce pride and maternal worry. She saw how the men respected him, how they called him Lord Snow or Lord Commander with genuine admiration. She heard the whispers of the wildlings he had allowed through the wall, forging an uneasy alliance in preparation for the coming darkness. She realized that Jon was stepping beyond the old bounds of the Watch, risking everything for what he believed was right. She feared for him as tensions rose, and in the quiet hours, mother and son shared stories of their past, bridging the years of secrecy. Lyanna told him tales of her youth, her love of riding, her stubborn defiance of her brothers when they tried to confine her to Leda-like pursuits. She did not speak openly of Rhaegar, only that she had loved a man who believed in songs of ice and fire. Jon listened, eyes thoughtful, as though he sensed there was more to the story than she dared say. At times, she considered revealing his parentage fully, now that the world was threatened by a greater evil. Yet she held her tongue. The knowledge might burden him further, or even imperil him if certain southern lords discovered he was Rhaegar's heir. Perhaps the truth would serve no one. Life at the wall was harsh. Food was meager, morale was often low, and the Black brothers were a rough lot. Still, Lyanna found a kind of purpose there. She had been a restless spirit all her life, but as she helped the Night's Watch prepare for the final battle, she found meaning in the fight for survival. She prayed silently to the old gods that her son would lead these men to victory, that the realm of men would not fall under an endless winter. And she prayed for forgiveness for all her lies, all her betrayals, which had begun the day she rode away with Rhaegar Targaryen. If the gods were just, they would spare Jon from paying the price of her choices. When the first horns sounded from atop the wall, echoing across the ice and stone, Lyanna felt her blood run cold. Shouts rose from the ramparts. Fires were lit. The day had finally come. The army of the dead approached. White Walkers and Whites in staggering numbers. A sea of silent death emerging from the darkness beyond. Jon led the defenders, flanked by wildling chieftains, Black brothers, and a scattering of northern lords who had answered the call. Lyanna stood on a walkway near the top of the wall, helping pass buckets of flaming oil to hurl down. She watched in horror as the undead crashed against the gates like a rotted tide. She saw skeletons climbing the ice with inhuman agility, only to be knocked down by archers or shattered by spiked grapnels. Screams and the stench of death filled the air. Somehow, through all the chaos, she spied Jon on the battlements below, wielding Longclaw, a Valyrian steel sword gifted to him by Mormont. It gleamed in the pale moonlight, cutting down wights that came too close. A White Walker advanced on him, tall, with eyes like frozen starlight, brandishing an ice-forged blade. Lyanna couldn't breathe. She watched, heart in her throat, as Jon met the creature's strike. The icy sword shattered against Valyrian steel, and Jon thrust forward, the walker crumbling into shards of frost and bone. A triumphant roar went up from the men near him. Tears burned Lyanna's eyes. In that moment she thought, he is a hero. She felt the echo of Rhaegar's dreams, the talk of a prophesied champion. Whether or not Jon was that figure, he was here now, defending the realm. Her child, born of love and war, forging hope from despair. The battle raged for hours or days. Time lost meaning. Exhausted, battered, and frostbitten, the defenders of the wall held. The dawn rose on fields of ice and corpses. The White Walkers vanished back into the swirling snow, though they would return again, in greater force. Lyanna stumbled through the carnage, searching for Jon. Her legs shook with every step across the frozen ground littered with the dead. At last, she found him slumped against a shattered ballista, breathing heavily, his cloak torn. A streak of blood darkened one side of his face, and his sword arm trembled with exhaustion. But he was alive. She knelt beside him, pressing her forehead to his, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Jon," she whispered, voice cracking. "My boy, you did it." He managed a wan smile, eyes flickering with exhaustion. "We all did it. We have to keep doing it, until they're gone for good." She helped him up, her arms around his waist. Together, they limped back toward the gates. Men and women of the Watch, wildlings, and northern volunteers all stared at Jon with newfound respect, some even kneeling in the blood-stained snow. He tried to wave them off, unwilling to play the hero. But Lyanna saw the gratitude in their eyes. They had faced the darkest of nights and survived, thanks in part to Jon Snow's leadership. As they passed through the courtyard, the bleak sunrise illuminating the aftermath of war, Lyanna heard whispers from those gathered. "He's the one," they said. "He's chosen by the old gods." Others murmured about Targaryen lineage, though they had no proof. The rumor might have begun among the wildlings or from Samwell Tarly's readings about Dragonstone and the prophecy of Azor Ahai. Lyanna felt her heart pound. If these whispers spread, if southern ears heard them, Jon's life could be at risk. Then again, the realm might need such a legend to unite against the army of the dead. She bit her lip, uncertain how to proceed. For now, she simply guided her son to the maester's chambers to have his wounds tended. She helped him remove his armor, piece by piece, her hands shaking. Blood soaked his gambeson. She dabbed at the cuts, tears sliding freely. But she blinked them away, whispering encouragement. When the maester arrived with bandages and potions, she lingered by Jon's side, her hand clasping his. He winced as the maester cleaned the wounds, but squeezed her fingers in silent reassurance. Though he was the Lord Commander, the man who slew a White Walker, he was still her son. She would never forget that fragile infant she had cradled in the Tower of Joy, fighting for breath, the child she had nearly died to bring into the world. Her every choice since had been for him. He looked up at her with a faint grin, wincing. "I'm sorry, I worried you." She choked back a laugh that was half sob, half relief. "A mother always worries for her child," she managed. "Even if that child becomes a legend." Exhausted, battered, but alive, Jon took her hand in his. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything." In that moment, Lyanna felt a deep sense of completion. She had raised him through secrecy, sacrifice, and war. Yet he had become a beacon of hope, not just for her but for all those who followed him. Regardless of what lay in his blood, Stark or Targaryen, he was Jon, her son, and he was forging a path that might save the realm. She pressed her lips to his brow. Despite the howling winds outside, despite the knowledge that more battles with the dead loomed, A kernel of peace settled in her heart. She stayed at Castle Black in the days that followed, helping rebuild and prepare for the next assault. Alongside Jon, she witnessed the forging of fragile alliances with southern lords who finally understood the threat from beyond the wall. Word came that Daenerys Targaryen had landed in Westeros with her dragons. Lyanna stiffened at the name but kept silent. She wondered if the Targaryen queen might sense something of rigor in Jon. She wondered if the realm might find salvation in the union of fire and ice. But those were questions for another day. Each dawn, Lyanna stepped onto the ramparts, gazing out at the endless expanse of snow and ice. She remembered how she'd once loved to ride through the fields of Winterfell, her hair streaming behind her, feeling invincible. Now she was older, scarred by experience, yet more at peace. In a way, she had found her true purpose. Her life was not the tragedy many thought. It was a story of devotion, of forging a new future from the embers of war. She had survived captivity, heartbreak, and the betrayal of dreams. Yet she had nurtured a life that stood against the dead themselves. On the cold wind, she thought she heard the faintest echo of a harp's melody. Rhaegar's gentle tune from so many years past, as though the spirits of the fallen hovered near. She closed her eyes, letting tears fall, and offered a prayer of thanks to whatever powers watched over them. Then she opened her eyes again, her gaze steady, and walked along the wall to rejoin Jon. The night's darkness might come again, but they would face it together. And Lyanna Stark, the wolf who had dared to love a dragon, stood tall at her son's side, unafraid. Lyanna Stark woke before dawn most days, wandering the top of the wall with a lantern in hand, peering out over the vast northern wastes. The frigid wind whipped her furs, and snow stung her cheeks until they turned raw, but she had learned to endure the cold long ago. She found a kind of grim peace in the solitude. The watchman nodded as she passed, some murmuring a respectful "My Lady" or "Lady Lyanna." Though she held no official title here, they had grown used to her silent presence. This she-wolf of House Stark who chose to stay in the austere stronghold of Castle Black even when she might have sought more comfort among the northern lords. Yet every time she felt the urge to leave, she would think of her son, Jon Snow, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and stay. She had sacrificed nearly everything to see him safely into manhood. She could not abandon him now, with the realm tipping toward disaster. Once, she had believed the worst horror in the world was men's brutality. The wars that had snatched away her father, her brother Brandon, and ultimately her brother Ned, who had been a pillar of her life. Yet it was now clear that a greater threat loomed in the far north. She had witnessed that threat with her own eyes during the undead assault on the wall. Legions of wights, skeletal and rotting, climbing the ice as if guided by some silent command. And among them had been White Walkers, tall, pale shapes with eyes like shards of blue ice, nearly impossible to kill save by dragonglass or Valyrian steel. If not for Jon's leadership, if not for the courage of the men of the Watch, many more would have perished. Even so, the battle had been terrible. The courtyard still bore scorch marks where barrels of flaming pitch had been dropped to keep the dead from overrunning the battlements. The bodies of the fallen were long since cleared away, but the memory of the stench clung to the stones. Guilt sometimes gnawed at Lyanna in the quiet hours. She remembered how Rhaegar Targaryen, the father of her child, had spoken of prophecy, of a prince who was promised to stand against the darkness. She had been young and in love, and she had believed him, at least, enough to share his bed and risk the wrath of King Aerys and all the Seven Kingdoms. She wondered if Rhaegar, in his fierce devotion to prophecy, had foreseen this very threat. Perhaps he had glimpsed the shape of wars to come, the marching dead, and believed his bloodline might produce a savior. Lyanna felt no certainty about such things, but whenever she glimpsed her son pacing the courtyard or conferring with wildling chieftains, she sensed a power in him beyond the measure of mere men. She did not know if that power was Targaryen or Stark, ice or fire, or some blend that transcended both. All she knew was that he fought for life, and he fought well. The sky lightened into a pale gray as dawn approached. Lyanna turned from the parapet and descended the icy steps, the lantern flame flickering. The wind raked at her hair, She had braided it into a single dark plait that fell between her shoulders, shot through re and there with a few strands of silver, a sign of her years. Gone was the wild maiden who had raced horses against stable boys at Winterfell. She felt older than her age, with lines of worry etched at the corners of her eyes. She pressed a hand to her chest, where a small leather pouch rested beneath her cloak. Inside was a single lock of Jon's hair from when he was a babe, still black, wrapped in a scrap of cloth embroidered with the dire wolf of House Stark. She had sewn it herself in secrecy all those years ago, during long nights of hiding after the Tower of Joy. Back then, secrecy had been her only shield. She reached the bottom of the steps and made her way to the common yard, passing black brothers who were just stirring to their early duties. She could almost imagine a younger Jon among them, a boy of 14, uncertain in his place but eager to prove himself. Now he was no boy but a man, and the Lord Commander no less, chosen by the men for his valor and sense of honor. She was proud beyond words, and terrified for him at once. Power was a double-edged sword in a world of cunning lords and hidden agendas. Even here, at the edge of the known world, men whispered of politics, alliances, betrayals. That was the way of things. Lyanna had learned it the hard way, from the day she defied her family's will to run with Rhaegar Targaryen. Secrets and trust had shaped her entire life. She entered the common hall, where the smell of oat porridge and bacon grease drifted in the air. A few benches were already occupied by bleary-eyed watchmen finishing their meal. She returned the lantern to a hook by the door, then helped herself to a bowl of porridge and a heel of bread. She no longer fussed over the plainness of the food. Life here demanded practicality. She ate quickly, quietly, and gave the leftover bread to a scarred young steward who looked half-starved. He muttered a thanks. Lyanna studied his face. She recognized in him the raw fear that had settled in so many fresh recruits since the White Walkers first came. The petty crimes or misfortunes that had led men to the wall felt trivial compared to the terror of the dead. She reached out and put a hand on his shoulder, a small gesture of comfort. He swallowed, nodded, and returned to his chores. When she left the hall, she headed across the courtyard to the Lord Commander's solar. The door was thick oak bound in iron, but the guards, 2 men in black cloaks, stepped aside for her. They knew she was the mother of their Lord Commander, though few spoke of it plainly. Jon had once told the entire castle that she was Ned Stark's sister, a Stark who had chosen to remain at the wall in these desperate times. But somewhere along the way, through hints and half-truths, enough of them had pieced together that her bond with Jon was deeper than simple aunt and nephew. Even so, none dared question or spread rumors. Not now, with the rising tide of the dead overshadowing all lesser matters. She knocked softly, then pushed the door open. Jon stood near a small brazier where the coals glowed orange in the gloom. Papers lay scattered across a table. Letters from the few lords in the north still loyal to the name Stark, from wildling representatives trying to resettle beyond the wall, from scouts reporting sightings of undead movements. He was dressed in black breeches and a leather jerkin, his thick cloak hanging from a hook on the far wall. The fur collar had been singed in the last skirmish, and one of the black brothers was trying to mend it. Jon's hair, dark and slightly curled, brushed just above his shoulders. He turned at the sound of the door, and the lines of worry on his face momentarily softened. "Good morrow," Lyanna said, closing the door. "Have you slept?" He shook his head, the ghost of a tired smile flickering. "A little, enough to get by." Then he gestured to the table. "A raven came from the south last night. It arrived while you were on the rampart. It bears news about Daenerys Targaryen." Lyanna's breath caught. The name alone could send a nervous tremor through her, for it conjured images of Rhaegar, dragons, and the Targaryen blood that ran secretly in Jon's veins. She gathered herself. "What news?" Jon's voice was low. "She has landed on Dragonstone and claimed it as her seat. They say she has 3 dragons, grown to monstrous size, and an army of Unsullied. The Lannisters hold King's Landing, but they have been forced to cede part of the Crownlands to her by now. The Raven claims that Lady Melisandre, the Red Priestess once with Stannis, has joined forces with Daenerys. And there is talk that Daenerys invites the North to treat with her. She wants unity to face the threat beyond the wall. Or so her letters claim. His mouth twisted slightly. But many would-be kings and queens have made false promises in this war. Lyanna remembered the Red Priestess. She had visited Castle Black once in the midst of the war, seeking royal blood and prophecies. A shiver ran down Lyanna's spine, recalling how the priestess's eyes had seemed to pierce through her, as though glimpsing the secrets buried in Lyanna's heart. She said softly, "Does she truly believe Daenerys will stand against the White Walkers?" Jon's expression was troubled. She might, if she believes that is the path to power, or if she truly cares about the realm. We cannot say for sure. He paused, running a hand through his hair. We have no king in the north. Robb, he died at the twins. Sansa and Arya, we don't know their whereabouts with certainty. Bran and Rickon were gone for so long that many believe them dead. Word reached us that your nephew Bran survived and traveled beyond the wall, but he has not come to us. Rickon, too, might still live somewhere in the chaos, but the rumors conflict. The Boltons hold Winterfell, or did at last account. Perhaps by now they've lost it or been forced out by some other tide of war. Lyanna felt the familiar pang of grief at the memory of Robb, murdered in that monstrous betrayal. She had wept until her eyes burned, then forged onward, determined not to let another generation of Starks vanish into the dirt. She closed her eyes. If Daenerys truly sits at Dragonstone, perhaps we can at least open a conversation. We need the realm united. We cannot hold back the dead alone. Jon nodded. I mean to send an envoy south. Perhaps I'll go myself if the Watch can spare me. But the Watch is stretched thin. What do you think? Lyanna exhaled, stepping closer to the brazier to warm her hands. I think you are Lord Commander now. Your first vow is to the wall. Yet if we cannot find allies, all our vows will crumble when the White Walkers advance in force. She glanced at him. Would you be safe among the Targaryens? Robert's hatred died with him, but the Lannisters might harbor suspicion of any Stark, and the Targaryen queen might suspect any northern men. Still, you are not just a Stark. You are also her blood, though neither of you knows it. That might influence destiny in ways we cannot foresee. Jon's face tightened. Sometimes I wish I knew none of this. I wish I were just Ned Stark's bastard. No hidden truths or whispers of dragon's blood. But there's no use wishing. We must do what we must do. He took a breath. Let me talk with Tormund Giantsbane and the other wildling leaders. If we leave the Watch under Ed Tollett's command, he might hold the line for some weeks while I go south. If I have your counsel, I'll be stronger for it. She placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of him through the leather. Then I will go with you. Jon's eyes flickered with relief and gratitude. He said nothing more, simply clasped her hand. They stood for a moment in the hush of the solar, mother and son, each carrying burdens beyond measure. Sometimes Lyanna felt as though all the years of secrecy and heartbreak had led to this very crucible, to stand beside her child in the face of an unimaginable enemy, forging alliances that might save humankind. Within a week, they made ready to depart. The decision stirred dissent among the Black brothers, for many believed the Lord Commander should remain at the wall until the next assault from the undead. But Jon argued that if the Seven Kingdoms remained divided, the next assault might overwhelm them all. A small group of rangers would ride south, led by the Lord Commander himself, carrying letters to the great houses, if they could be found and compelled to read them. Lyanna would accompany him, as well as Tormund and a few wildling warriors eager to see the south with their own eyes. Ghost, Jon's great white direwolf, padded at their side, silent as a wraith among the snow. They rode out from Castle Black on a clouded morning. A bitter wind howled over the ice, but the sky promised no fresh storms. A scattering of Black brothers stood to watch them go, faces grim and uncertain. It was not every day that the Lord Commander abandoned his seat, and all prayed he would return. Lyanna wore thick fur over her plain riding leathers. She had refused to adorn herself with the Stark sigil for fear it would draw unwelcome notice from Lannister soldiers or other enemies. Jon, too, dressed modestly, though he carried the fine Valyrian steel blade, Longclaw at his hip, the pommel carved into a direwolf's head instead of a bear. That sword alone marked him as someone of import. But in dangerous lands, the ability to fight often superseded stealth. Their path south took them first to the Gift, that broad swath of land originally dedicated to supporting the Night's Watch. It lay largely abandoned these days, the few farmers and crofters who remained frightened by the roving dangers. Some had fled to join the Umbers or Karstarks, others had disappeared, possibly taken by brigands or raiders. The land had a forlorn look. Untended fields, sagging barns, fences broken by wind and time. They passed no more than a handful of people on the first day. On the second day, they found a small inn near a cluster of pine trees. It was run by a gnarled old woman who had once been a midwife in the north. She recognized Lyanna's face as belonging to a Stark. "I've seen your features on them statues at Winterfell," she muttered, but said nothing more. Perhaps she was confused, or perhaps she guessed that the world was too perilous for pointed questions. Jon and Tormund bartered for rooms and a meager supper of boiled turnips and salted venison. The wildling leader complained loudly about the lack of proper drink, but he ate enough for 3 men. Lyanna listened as Tormund regaled them with tales of giants in the far north, of how he once bedded a she-bear. Jon raised an eyebrow, and Lyanna merely sipped her ale, remembering that wildlings had their own brand of storytelling. When they retired, mother and son took a small chamber with 2 straw pallets. The walls were thin, and the wind hissed through cracks in the shutters. Lyanna wrapped herself in her cloak and lay sleepless, listening to the muffled rasp of Jon's breathing. She wondered if this was how life might have been years ago, had they been free to travel together without fear. Then again, the fear was always there, lurking just beyond the circle of firelight. She thought of the wall behind them, of the White Walkers gathering in the endless night, and she could not rest. Around midnight, she rose quietly, tiptoed past Jon, and went outside. The inn's courtyard was deserted, just a few horses shifting in the stable. Clouds obscured the moon. She stepped beyond the flickering torchlight, gazing across the dark horizon. A swirl of memory seized her. She recalled a night long ago, in a room at the Tower of Joy, where she had labored in childbirth while swords clashed outside. The voices of men had echoed in her delirium. Ned's voice, Arthur Dayne's, swirling in the air as if carried on a hot wind. The single candle had guttered in its holder, and all she had cared about was delivering her child safely. She had prayed to the old gods and the new, prayed that he would live. Her prayers had been granted, though not without cost. Now, as she stood in the chilly courtyard, she marveled at the path life had carved for both of them. Her son was grown, carrying a sword of Valyrian steel, chosen to protect the realm from nightmares. Perhaps Rhaegar had been right about prophecy, or perhaps the gods were simply cruel. Either way, she silently vowed she would stand with Jon as long as breath remained in her body. They continued on the following day, crossing the last river by a rickety wooden bridge. Ghost prowled at the edges of the party, occasionally vanishing into the pines to reappear moments later, muzzle twitching. The presence of the direwolf unsettled some of the southern travelers they encountered, but once they recognized the black cloaks, many greeted Jon with cautious respect. The War of the 5 Kings had decimated so many houses, so many common folk, that these days few had the strength to cause trouble unless they rode under a major banner. Lyanna did notice a band of desperate men eyeing their party from a grove of dying birches, but Tormund rode out, sword in hand, and shouted a curse that sent them scattering. At last, on a day that broke with watery sunlight, they reached the outskirts of Winterfell's domain. Lyanna's heart twisted at the sight of the land where she had grown up, a land now marred by war, burned fields, and the deep scars left by the Boltons. Smoke rose from a few distant chimneys. She and Jon exchanged a glance. This was the place that had once been their refuge, a proud seat of House Stark for thousands of years. Ned, Benjen, Brandon, all gone. Only ghosts remained. As they approached, they saw that Winterfell stood under the banner of the flayed man, though other flags flew beneath it, faint glimpses of a golden lion. The Lannisters had, at some point, forced an alliance or occupation. Lyanna's fury rose at the thought of a Bolton Lannister arrangement in the ancestral Stark seat. But she tempered her reaction. They were here to find allies or pass quietly. Tormund scowled, muttering, "We should raise the place and mount their heads on spikes." Jon shook his head. "We don't have the numbers for a direct fight, and time is short. We must reach White Harbor or the Vale to find a ship south. We can't risk being drawn into a siege." Lyanna agreed, though it pained her. This was her childhood home, the yard where she had once raced with a wooden sword in hand, beating Ben-Jen in mock combat. A place of memory and love, now defiled by traitors. Still, the living threatened by the dead could not afford personal vengeance. Not yet. With a heavy heart, they skirted Winterfell, traveling by hidden back roads where the old growth of the wolfswood offered cover. Occasionally, they glimpsed a patrol of Bolton men, hard-faced riders in mismatched armor, but they managed to remain unseen. It helped that Ghost could smell them from afar. In 2 days, they reached the King's Road south of Winterfell, passing small folk cowering in battered wagons. Tales of the Boltons' cruelty abounded. Forced conscriptions, burned villages, hunts for any rumored Stark supporters. Lyanna's anger grew, but she kept her focus on the mission. Jon, too, remained stoic, though she saw tension in his eyes. She knew he ached to challenge the Boltons, to reclaim his father's seat. Father Ned, who had raised him as a bastard to protect his lineage, who had died in King's Landing. But Jon had chosen the Watch, sworn to forsake land and titles. Such a conflict tore at him because the realm needed leadership from the north as well. At times, Lyanna wondered if the oaths of the Watch could survive a war that threatened all living souls. They pressed on, day after weary day, passing out of the frost-laden fields into milder terrain as the roads carried them south. Winter still clung to the land, though the worst of the snows had eased. They encountered a few merchants and travelers who recognized the black cloaks but scarcely believed these men truly came from the Wall. Many had heard rumors of the undead threat but dismissed them as wild stories. Others took them seriously. One day, near a half-collapsed tower by a lonely stretch of road, a group of refugees begged Jon for help, claiming that whites had slaughtered their village. Jon gave them what provisions he could spare and told them to head north, ironically, to find safety at Castle Black. Tormund barked out a laugh at the idea that men might flee south to north for salvation. Eventually, the road curved toward White Harbor, the only major port in the north capable of sending them across the sea to the Vale or possibly to the Crownlands. Lyanna had always found White Harbor a curious mix of northern sensibility and southern influence, with its fish markets and stately marble architecture. If the Manderleys still held the city, they might find a ship or a friendly face. But war had a way of turning even friends uncertain. They caught their first glimpse of White Harbor at dusk. A shimmer of torchlight reflected off the harbor's waters, the tall masts of ships rising like dark needles. The walls of the city remained intact, and the proud white towers still rose above the shoreline, though the city's outlying areas showed scars of conflict. Burned farmsteads dotted the approach. The gates were watched by men clad in the mermaid sigil of House Manderley. Lyanna felt a hint of relief that the city had not fallen to the Boltons or the Ironborn. The Manderleys had always been loyal to House Stark. Perhaps they would give them a chance. When they presented themselves at the gate, Jon introduced himself as Jon Snow, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, accompanied by loyal rangers. Lyanna gave only her name, Lyanna, a member of House Stark who had come to treat with Lord Manderley on urgent matters. She said nothing of being Ned's sister. Her face alone might prompt enough recognition. Tormund stood behind them, arms folded across his broad chest, grinning in a way that set the guards on edge. Ghost prowled near their horses, drawing wary stares. The guards conferred among themselves, then opened the gates. "You'll be escorted to Lord Manderley," one said, gesturing for them to follow. Inside the city, the streets were crowded even at dusk. Merchants hawking goods, fisherfolk unloading nets, sellswords glaring from corners. War had brought both ruin and opportunity. Soldiers in Manderley colors patrolled, keeping what order they could. Lyanna smelled salt air mixed with rotting fish, and it reminded her of how far she had traveled from Winterfell, from her old life. They were brought to the new castle, the stronghold from which the Manderleys governed. Guards in sea-green cloaks led them across a wide courtyard under the watchful eyes of statues depicting long-dead Manderley heroes. In the main hall, they waited briefly among a swirl of servants and lesser knights. Then Lord Wyman Manderley himself emerged from a side chamber, walking with difficulty on account of his great girth. He looked older than Lyanna remembered. His hair had gone almost entirely white, and the flesh under his chin sagged. But his eyes remained bright, and he gave a sharp intake of breath when he recognized her. "Lady Lyanna Stark," he said, voice booming in the stone hall. "I had thought you long dead or lost, yet here you stand." She offered a measured courtesy. "My lord, I have been in the north at the wall these many years. We come on a mission to unite the realm against a terror greater than any war of kings. This is my son." She caught herself. In front of the watchers, she used the old lie. "My nephew, Jon Snow, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch." Jon inclined his head. "My lord." Manderley studied him with curiosity. "Ah yes, Ned Stark's rumored bastard, if I recall the talk. But the seat of the Night's Watch is no small matter, especially in these times." He paused, eyes narrowing. "Word has reached us of the horrors beyond the wall. We've heard how you slew a White Walker at Hardhome, how you brought wildlings south to join you in the so-called Great War to come. Yet many in the south do not believe these tales. They call them nonsense or northern superstition." "They will believe," Jon said quietly. "Once the dead are breaking down their gates. We came to seek ships, to travel south and speak with Daenerys Targaryen, who is rumored to be rallying the realm. If we stand divided, there is no hope for any of us." Lord Manderley's expression was cautious. "Daenerys Targaryen, the Dragon Queen. We've heard rumor she's taken Dragonstone, that she stands against the Lannisters. We were sworn to the Starks, but so many betrayals have befallen the north. The Boltons hold Winterfell under Lannister approval. We Manderleys are in a precarious position. Still, we have not bent the knee to the flayed man. We remain loyal to Ned Stark's memory, if not to the boy who called himself king in the north and lost his crown at the Twins." Lyanna felt a stab of sorrow at the mention of Robb, but she forced a steady tone. "Then stand loyal now, my lord. Help us gain passage so we may gather allies. Let the realm see that House Manderley remains true. If we fail, the north will be the first to fall under the advancing dead. But that doom will not stop at Moat Cailin. It will sweep across every land." Manderley stroked his double chin. His gaze flicked between mother and son. "You have my ear, Lady Lyanna. As for providing ships, that will require caution. The seas are not entirely safe. Ironborn pirates prowl. And if the Boltons hear that I have aided a Stark, they may attempt to lay siege to White Harbor. Yet you speak truth. The North's survival demands unity." He let out a heavy sigh. "Let us speak more privately. I would know more of what you have seen." That night, they dined with Lord Manderley in a smaller chamber off the main hall. The walls were hung with tapestries of mermaids and tridents, the flickering sconces giving the space a muted warmth. The table was laden with fish stew, loaves of crusty bread, a bit of roast mutton. Lyanna sat beside Jon, across from their host. Tormund joined them, devouring stew with gusto, while the handful of watchmen and wildlings traveling with them ate outside or found places in the servants' hall. Lord Manderley asked question after question about the undead, Hardhome, the Wildling Alliance, and the state of Castle Black. Jon answered gravely, describing the shrieks of the Whites, the unnatural cold that preceded the White Walkers, the hopelessness of any fight without weapons that could break their magic. Lyanna added details from the battle at the wall. Manderley listened, at times going pale and crossing himself. By the end, he sank back in his chair, wiping sweat from his brow. "The realm is so consumed by petty wars that it hardly heeds an enemy beyond comprehension," he murmured. "Starks, Boltons, Lannisters, Targaryens, none of that matters to the dead." "Very well, Lord Commander, Lady Lyanna. I will give you what ships I can spare, no more than 3. with enough crew to see you to Dragonstone or whichever port is safer. I cannot muster a great fleet, but I'll not sit idle while the night closes in." Lyanna bowed her head in gratitude. "Your help will not be forgotten, my lord." Thus it was decided. Manderley arranged for 3 stout cogs loaded with supplies to be prepared in secret, to avoid rousing suspicion from Lannister or Bolton informants. Meanwhile, Lyanna and Jon took lodging in the castle, waiting for the ships to be provisioned. Tormund grumbled that sea travel was for milk drinkers and Southron lapdogs, but he grudgingly agreed. The land route to Dragonstone would be too fraught with enemies and might take far too long. Speed was of the essence if they hoped to convince Daenerys Targaryen to ally with the North before the final winter storm arrived. On their 3rd night in White Harbor, Lyanna stood on a balcony that overlooked the harbor, breathing in the cold, salt air. She wore a plain woolen gown beneath her cloak, the wind snatching at her sleeves. Far below, she could hear the lap of waves against the docks and see the lanterns bobbing on the ships. Her mind wandered to memories of Harrenhal, where Rhaegar had sung so heartbreakingly before the entire assembly, and where he had placed a crown of winter roses in her lap. She had been so young, so enthralled by the prince's gentle voice and quiet ardor. She had not foreseen the bloodshed that would follow, or the price everyone would pay. Her thoughts drifted to Daenerys Targaryen, Rhaegar's youngest sister, born amidst the chaos of Robert's rebellion. She recalled the rumors that Queen Rhaella had fled to Dragonstone heavily pregnant, that Daenerys had been born during a storm. If Rhaegar had lived, this girl would have been his sister, possibly married to one of her other brothers. Such was Targaryen custom, or perhaps betrothed to some powerful lord. Instead, she had fled across the narrow sea as an infant growing up in exile. Now she returned with dragons. How would she react to a supposed Stark bastard who was in fact her nephew by blood? Would she sense something in Jon, some intangible connection of Targaryen lineage? Or had the years of war and hardship hardened her into a queen who would trust no one? A soft footstep behind her broke her reverie. She turned to see Jon, dark hair brushing his collar, face etched with concern. "Mother," he said quietly, stepping out onto the balcony. The words still sent a tremor of relief and joy through her after all these years of hiding. Sometimes in private, he spoke it freely. She felt a pang of regret that they had lost so many years of being able to say it openly. She reached for his hand. "Jon, you should be resting." He shook his head. "I couldn't sleep. My mind keeps returning to the battles to come, to what we might find on Dragonstone." He exhaled, gazing over the harbor. If Daenerys truly has dragons, they could be a powerful weapon against the undead. Fire and dragonglass, Valyrian steel, they're the only things we've seen that can kill them. But forging trust between the Night's Watch and a Targaryen queen will not be simple. Especially not when the Boltons hold Winterfell and might denounce us. Lyanna squeezed his hand. "The North remembers, Jon, and some do still remember that House Stark fought against the Mad King, that we bled for our freedom. Even if the Boltons claim to speak for the North, they are turncloaks at heart. As for Daenerys, she was an innocent babe when her father burned mine. No child should bear the sins of their parent. And you," she hesitated, swallowing, "you bear none of Aerys's cruelty. You have Rhaegar's blood, yes, but your heart is your own." He grimaced. "If only we could speak of that freely, but the secret remains. Do you believe we should tell her?" The question hung in the cold night air. Lyanna glanced at the dark horizon, picturing the swirl of war across the 7 kingdoms. Lannisters, Targaryens, Baratheons, Tyrells, and the scattered remains of House Stark. If the truth would unify us and help save the realm, perhaps. Yet it might also plant seeds of suspicion or conflict. Daenerys might see you as a rival claimant to the Iron Throne. And I can only imagine how the lords of Westeros might react to learning that a Targaryen heir was raised at the Wall. She sighed. "I do not know, Jon. We must gauge her carefully. Until then, best to keep your parentage hidden." He nodded reluctantly. "I understand. Sometimes I wish I had grown up never knowing. But I cannot regret your presence in my life, Mother. Without you, I would have felt so lost." She drew him into a gentle embrace, resting her head on his shoulder. "I am here always, and we will face whatever comes together." The next morning, under Lord Manderley's discreet arrangements, Lyanna, Jon, Tormund, and their small band boarded the 3 ships at the docks. The vessels were stout cogs designed for coastal travel, not the grand carracks that might brave open ocean voyages. But they would suffice for a journey down Westeros's eastern coast, so long as storms did not thwart them. The harbor waters reflected a sky heavy with gray clouds, though the tide was calm. Manderley himself came to bid them farewell. "Sail swiftly," he said. "If we can spare it, I will send more men to the wall when the time is right. But White Harbor must watch for Bolton retribution." He pressed a ring into Jon's hand, bearing the merman's sigil. "Show this to any Manderley you meet. It will at least prove you have our favor." Jon bowed in thanks. "If the realm stands together, we can end this threat. The Manderleys will be remembered among the realm's saviors." Manderley managed a thin smile, then turned to Lyanna. "My lady, I wish you luck and the blessings of the old gods. In you, I see a reflection of your brothers who once walked these halls. I hope to see House Stark restored. Farewell." She inclined her head, a lump in her throat. Perhaps in a kinder world, House Stark would have no need of restoration, for it would never have fallen. But this was the world they had. She joined Jon aboard the lead ship, while Tormund boarded another with his wildlings, each assigned a few Night's Watch Rangers for support. Before long, the sailors hauled anchor and let the tide carry them out of the harbor. Lyanna stood at the prow beside Jon, watching the walls of White Harbor recede. The gulls wheeled overhead, crying into the wind, and the salt spray clung to her cloak. Ghost prowled uneasily near the mast, clearly disliking the shift and roll of the deck, but unwilling to be parted from Jon. Their voyage south was fraught with unease. Though the seas proved relatively calm for the first few days, the threat of Ironborn raiders or Lannister warships loomed. The knowledge that the undead gathered in the far north pressed upon Lyanna's mind, a constant ache of dread. She passed many hours leaning on the rail, letting the sea breeze numb her face, reflecting on how the path of her life had led her from the Tower of Joy to the middle of this. Occasionally, she thought of Rhaegar and what he might say if he saw their son now, forging alliances to defend humanity. Would Rhaegar have bent the knee to Daenerys, or would he have seen himself as the rightful king? Another unanswerable question, lost to time. Jon spent much of the voyage speaking with the captains, mapping their route. They aimed to land near Crackclaw Point or even near Blackwater Bay if the political climate allowed. Daenerys' seat at Dragonstone was close to the capital, but rumors said the Lannisters still held King's Landing fiercely, led by Queen Cersei and her rumored madness. The labyrinth of alliances was daunting, and any misstep could cost them dearly. Lyanna often saw Jon's brow creased with worry as he tried to puzzle out how to gain an audience with Daenerys without provoking immediate hostility. They had no illusions that marching up to Dragonstone uninvited would be welcomed with open arms. The Queens Unsullied and Dothraki were reputed to be fearsome, and the dragons even more so. Yet they had to try. A fortnight passed on the water. The weather changed from frigid to merely brisk, and the sea's greenish hue turned to a deeper blue in calmer latitudes. They sighted a few ships in the distance. Some flew no banner, others displayed unfamiliar sigils, but none approached. Now and then, Tormund let out loud complaints from the sister ship, claiming the sea would swallow them all. Lyanna half smiled at the wildlings' discomfort, though her own stomach lurched whenever the waves rose. Only Jon seemed unbothered, gazing steadily at the horizon as if the endless waters were just another battlefield. One morning, gulls circled overhead in large numbers. The captain pointed to a line of rocky coastline in the distance. "That be Crackclaw Point," he said, spitting over the side. "There's a village or two, but it's rough country. If you aim for Dragonstone, we'll need to pass near Blackwater Bay. But the Lannister fleet might be patrolling." Jon and Lyanna conferred briefly. They risked interception by Lannister war galleys if they strayed too close to the bay, yet an overland route through Crackclaw Point could be just as dangerous. That forested region was notorious for fierce local clans who recognized no king's authority save their own. If they tried to slip past them, they might find themselves fighting in the bogs. Still, traveling over land would at least avoid the Lannister navy. Finally, they decided to sail as far as Massey's Hook, near the Weeping Tower, and from there attempt an overland approach to Dragonstone's coast. It was a dangerous compromise. The captain agreed, though with evident reluctance. "Just so we steer clear of the Redwine Straits," he said, "where Queen Cersei's warships prowl." They set sail accordingly, hugging the coastline as closely as the rocky shoals allowed. The days grew shorter, though not as drastically as in the north, and the nights brought fitful dreams. Lyanna often awoke in a cold sweat, imagining the clash of swords and the wail of newborn Jon from her distant past. More than once, she walked the deck in the moonlight, only to find Jon there too, gazing out over the Black Sea. They would talk quietly of Ned, of Robb, of the future they hoped to build if the living could triumph. At last, on an overcast afternoon, they dropped anchor near a jagged promontory that jutted into the sea. The bleak shoreline beyond rose in craggy hills and sparse trees, battered by salty winds. Lyanna squinted at the land. It felt dismal, inhospitable, but that might serve them well if it discouraged prying eyes. The sailors lowered rowboats, and the band of travelers disembarked with what supplies they could carry: food, water, tents, and enough weapons to defend themselves. Tormund nearly fell into the surf, cursing the damned watery ground. Ghost splashed out of the boat, shaking himself. Lyanna set foot on the stony beach and breathed a sigh of relief to be on solid land again. Jon spoke with the captains, instructing them to sail back north or find a safe cove to wait for them. They parted ways, uncertain if they would ever meet again. Then Jon and Lyanna led their group inland. The rocky slopes gave way to narrow trails flanked by wind-twisted pines. The gloom pressed down, but they pressed on, determined to skirt the main roads that led toward the Crownlands. They camped by a cold stream that night, setting watches. Lyanna lay awake, listening to the rustle of pine needles and the occasional soft growl from Ghost. In the morning, they trudged onward, carefully crossing ravines and low hills. They encountered little sign of habitation save for old hearths or the occasional abandoned hut. Late in the afternoon, they came across a small band of ragged men wearing scraps of armor. The men demanded tolls for passing through their clan's territory. Jon tried to reason with them, offering coin and explaining they were on a mission of peace. The clansmen seemed tempted by the gold, but also eyed Tormund's sword hungrily. A scuffle nearly broke out when one of the clansmen grabbed at a watchman's pack. Jon stepped forward, calm but with authority. "We have no quarrel with you. Take this silver and let us pass. If you draw steel on us, I promise you'll regret it." He gestured subtly to Ghost, who bared his teeth, letting out a low rumble. The clansmen, outnumbered and intimidated, backed down, muttering curses. Lyanna watched with admiration. Jon's commanding presence, honed by battles beyond the wall, carried weight. He was not the uncertain boy who had once questioned his worth in Winterfell's courtyard. By the fourth day, they topped a rise and glimpsed the sea again, stretching out in a broad curve to their right. The coastline seemed closer than before, though the terrain remained difficult. The next day, they came upon a muddy track that looked more frequently traveled. They followed it cautiously. Early that evening, they rounded a bend to find a small fishing village huddled by a pebbled shore. Smoke curled from a few chimneys. A handful of rowboats bobbed in a makeshift harbor. Realizing they needed more provisions, the group approached, hands lifted in peace. The villagers eyed them warily, especially Tormund, who looked as large and fierce as any raider, and Ghost, whose red eyes gleamed. But when Jon displayed coin and asked for fish and shelter, they softened. Many men had gone off to wars or died at sea. Outsiders with gold were better than starving. They spent the night in a cramped barn, paying the fishers a few coins for salted cod, crusty bread, and water. Lyanna sat near Jon on a stack of netting, chewing the tough fish. "We must be close to the coast facing Dragonstone," she murmured. "I can almost see the shape of it out to sea, or imagine it." Dragonstone was said to be a volcanic island fortress of black stone towers shaped like dragons. She had never seen it, but Ned had once told her it was a grim, ancient place. He had visited after Stannis Baratheon was named Lord of Dragonstone following Robert's rebellion. Stannis was rumored to have left that seat to pursue the crown, but all those ambitions had ended in one battle or another. Now Daenerys claimed her ancestral stronghold. Jon nodded, finishing his meal. "We'll head south along the coast, then see if we can find a boat or a fisherman willing to ferry us across. Dragonstone lies not too far offshore, but the currents can be treacherous." He lowered his voice. "And if Daenerys has watchers, they might spot us. We should be prepared to be challenged the moment we land." Lyanna clenched her jaw. "We come in peace. Let's hope that's enough." They left at dawn, following the coastal track. Rain began to fall, a light drizzle that quickly soaked their cloaks. The wind blew in from the sea, and Lyanna tasted salt on her lips. Ghost trotted along, head low, damp fur plastered to his lean frame. Tormund grumbled about the miserable weather. Around midday, the rain slackened. They climbed a slope and halted abruptly at the sight before them, the narrow strait separating the mainland from Dragonstone. Even through the low clouds, Lyanna could see the looming fortress perched on a volcanic island, spires of black stone shaped into the forms of dragons, stone gargoyles leering over the sea. Smoke or steam rose from vents along the cliffsides. The water churned in a swirling tide. A few ships bobbed at anchor off the fortress's harbor, their sails furled. Tormund let out a snort. "Looks like a place for dark sorcery. Why would anyone build a castle like that?" Jon studied it. The Targaryens built it long ago before Aegon's conquest. Their seat in Westeros. They shaped the stones to look like dragons. Lyanna felt a faint chill. She recalled Rhaegar speaking once of ancient Valyria, how the Targaryens had left that doomed land with their dragons and chosen Dragonstone as their foothold. Standing here, gazing at those twisted towers, she felt the weight of centuries pressing down. This was the cradle of Targaryen power, in a time when dragons soared. Now, supposedly, dragons soared once more under Daenerys. They made their way to a small cove where a few battered fishing skiffs were pulled up on shore. No one was immediately visible. The group fanned out, searching. At last, they found a pair of fishermen in a shack, gutting cod. Jon approached carefully, offering coin in exchange for passage across the strait. The fishermen were old and half-blind, but they seemed canny enough. They demanded twice Jon's offer. Tormund barked a laugh and drew his dagger, but Lyanna placed a firm hand on the wildling's arm. They negotiated until the fishermen relented. The vessel would be small and cramped, but it could handle 10 men plus gear if they rowed carefully. Ghost would have to swim or ride in a second boat. The fishermen insisted on receiving payment up front, coin glinting in their greedy eyes. As they prepared to launch, the older fisherman spat over the side. "Might be you don't come back. That dragon queen's got unsullied soldiers. Heard they're half-demons. Heard she's got fire-breathing beasts that can melt a man in his armor. Only fools go looking for her fortress." Jon stowed their packs. "We are fools then, but with a purpose. The realm needs her help." The fisherman shook his head, muttering to his mate. "Realm's gone mad. Good luck to you, if luck's something that matters anymore." They pushed off from the sandy shore, the small boat rocking dangerously. Lyanna, Jon, and a handful of the watchmen took the first boat, while Tormund and the rest followed in the second. Ghost seemed to hate the entire affair but leapt in awkwardly, nearly capsizing the craft. The fishermen manned the oars with surprising skill, cutting through the choppy waters. Spray battered the sides. Lyanna gripped the rim, her stomach tightening with each crest. The black outline of Dragonstone loomed closer, its dark towers like claws reaching for the sky. As they approached the island's harbor, Lyanna spotted watchtowers perched along the rocky heights. Sure enough, a horn blast echoed across the water, and figures appeared on the battlements. The boat rocked in the uneasy swell. Jon placed a reassuring hand on Lyanna's shoulder, then raised the other in a clear gesture of peace. They glided closer, and she saw a stone quay ahead, guarded by men in leather and steel, armed with spears and shortbows. Closer still, she noticed a few in strange armor, unfamiliar, polished plate with helms shaped like insects or demon faces. Possibly some of Daenerys's foreign troops. Anxiety coiled in her belly. If they were mistaken for threats, they could be shot before they set foot on land. The fisherman guided the boat up to a worn stone step. One of the spearmen on the quay barked an order in a guttural accent. Another guard stepped forward, shouting in the common tongue. "Who goes there? State your names and purpose or turn back to the sea." Jon rose carefully, hands visible, cloak dripping with salt water. "I am Jon Snow, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. I come seeking an audience with Queen Daenerys Targaryen to beg her aid against the White Walkers and the army of the dead. This is my companion, Lyanna Stark." He gestured to the others. "We bring no hostilities." A murmur passed among the guards. One of them, wearing the sigil of a black and red dragon on his surcoat, glanced warily at Ghost. Another guard wearing helmet plumes shaped like a dragon's crest studied them, then gestured with his spear. "Disarm and come ashore slowly. Any false move and you die." Jon exchanged a look with Lyanna and nodded. He carefully unbuckled Longclaw and placed it in the bottom of the boat, raising his hands. Lyanna did the same with her dagger. The watchmen relinquished their swords. Tormund's boat landed next, the wildling looking disgruntled as he handed over his axe. The guards moved in, searching them for hidden weapons. Ghost growled but did not attack. When the guards were satisfied, one of them motioned for the group to follow up a steep path carved into the volcanic rock, flanked by switchbacks that led higher toward the fortress gate. They trudged in silence, the wind whipping around them, the crash of waves below. Lyanna's heart pounded. She felt the invisible eyes of archers on the walls, perhaps the watchful gaze of Daenerys Targaryen herself. At the top, a great gate of black iron stood open, revealing a courtyard beyond. Strange statues of dragons, their stone maws open in silent roars, lined the path. The group entered, watched by soldiers in unsullied armor, spears upright, faces expressionless behind tall helms. Ahead of them, a woman waited, clad in dark red robes. She had pale skin, red hair, and unsettling eyes that reminded Lyanna of hot coals. Melisandre, the Red Priestess. Lyanna's stomach clenched. She had seen this woman at the wall once, briefly, when she followed Stannis. Now she stood calmly beneath a carved dragon archway, her ruby necklace glowing faintly in the overcast light. "Lord Snow," Melisandre said in her accented voice, a faint smile curling her lips, "the Lord of Light spoke of your coming. And you, Lyanna Stark, how strange it is to see a ghost of a name." She tilted her head, gazing at Lyanna in a way that felt invasive, as though she saw more than mortal eyes should. "Welcome to Dragonstone. The Queen awaits." Jon moved forward, posture guarded. "We come in peace, seeking alliance against the Great Other and his servants." "Yes, yes," Melisandre said, turning with a swirl of her red robes. "Come, follow me. The night is dark and full of terrors, but the Queen of Dragons might offer hope or damnation, depending on how the fires burn." Her words, laced with that ominous flair, put Lyanna on edge. She cast a sidelong glance at Jon, who wore a mask of composure. Tormund's mouth was twisted in a silent snarl, clearly distrusting this priestess and all her talk of fire, but they had come too far to turn back. They followed Melisandre into the heart of Dragonstone. They passed through echoing corridors of black stone, lit by torch sconces shaped like dragon claws. The walls bore sigils of House Targaryen, a three-headed dragon of red on a field of black. Lyanna's footsteps faltered here and there as she noticed motifs of dragons bursting from flames, or ancient Valyrian glyphs etched into doorways. She couldn't help but imagine Rhaegar strolling these halls in younger years, perhaps strumming his silver-stringed harp while thinking of prophecy. At length, they emerged into a cavernous throne room carved from the volcanic rock. Pillars in the shape of twisting dragons soared overhead. The floor was laid with obsidian tiles that caught the torchlight. At the far end of the room stood a raised dais, on which a carved stone seat rested, shaped like a coiled serpent with dragon motifs. Standing beside that seat was Daenerys Targaryen herself, clad in dark leather and a flowing mantle clasped with a dragon brooch. Her silver-gold hair was braided, framing a face both youthful and commanding. Two dragons, smaller than the rumored great beasts but still large enough to terrify, coiled on either side of the dais, serpentine necks and wings half-furled. Their reptilian eyes flicked toward the newcomers, tongues flickering. Lyanna's blood seemed to freeze and burn at once. This was Rhaegar's sister, the last living Targaryen believed to be of that line, though another Targaryen stood right beside her, unseen and unknown by all but a few. Jon's posture was rigid as he approached, flanked by Tormund and a handful of watchmen. Lyanna stayed close, her heart pounding. She knew what was at stake. Melisandre glided past them, dipping her head to the queen. "Your Grace, I present to you Jon Snow, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and his companions. They beg an audience." Daenerys regarded them with cool curiosity. "I have heard tales of the Night's Watch from my advisors, tales of an ancient order sworn to guard the realms of men. But men have told many tales in these times." Her voice was firm, resonant in the stone hall. Jon stepped forward, unarmed. "Your Grace, thank you for receiving us. We come not to ask for gold or power. We come to beg your help. An army of the dead gathers beyond the wall. White walkers, wights, creatures of ice that cannot be killed by normal steel. If they breach the wall, all the 7 kingdoms will fall." Daenerys studied him. "I have heard the stories, but I have also heard that the North is in rebellion, that men call themselves kings only to die in foolish wars. Now you claim a different war awaits. Why should I believe you?" Lyanna felt the tension coil in her gut. This was the moment. Jon faced the queen's unwavering gaze, replying evenly, "Because I have fought them. I have seen them, lost brothers to them. The dragons you command may be the only chance we have to drive them back. If we do not unite, no throne will remain for you to claim." A ripple of movement to the queen's left revealed another figure stepping forward, a slender woman with short hair, face partially hidden by a cowl. She wore leathers that bore the sigil of a dragon upon them. Her eyes flicked over the newcomers with a calculating gleam. Then she spoke softly, "You come here unarmed, from the far north. Either you are supremely foolish or you speak truth. My queen, shall we test their words?" Daenerys nodded, though her expression betrayed neither acceptance nor rejection. "We shall see. For now, rest. My men will show you chambers where you can refresh yourselves. We will speak more on the morrow." Then her gaze settled on Lyanna. Something in the queen's violet eyes seemed to darken. "You, Stark, stand out among these black-clad brothers. Are you truly of House Stark? Or is that another fancy story?" Lyanna felt every nerve tingle. For a heartbeat, she wondered if Daenerys sensed the Targaryen blood in her son. But the question was directed at her alone. She cleared her throat. "I am Lyanna Stark, your Grace. I was long believed dead, but I survived the war. I served my family's interests in secrecy. The realm has changed much in my absence." Daenerys's pale eyebrows lifted. "Lyanna Stark, a name I know from old stories of Robert's rebellion. My brother Rhaegar. No, that is all in the past. So many illusions, so many tragedies." She paused. "It seems the dead are not the only ones returning from the grave. Very well. We will speak soon, Lyanna Stark." With that ominous remark, the queen gestured for her guards to lead them away. Lyanna's pulse hammered. She felt the eyes of the dragons on her back as she turned. In the hush of that moment, an unspoken tension seemed to fill the air. Jon placed a reassuring hand on Lyanna's arm, and they exited together, following the guards down another corridor of black stone. Their assigned chambers were small but not uncomfortable, clearly an old portion of the castle given over to guests or lesser dignitaries. The group reassembled in a common room. Tormund paced, brow furrowed. "This dragon queen is formidable. The men are on edge. I have half a mind to get back in that boat." Jon set aside his wet cloak. "She's our best chance, Tormund. We need her dragons. Now we must convince her that the dead are real, and that we pose no threat to her claim on the throne. A watchman spoke up. And if she decides to cast us in chains, or feed us to her dragons? Jon's face was grim. Then we fight our way out if we must. But let us hope it doesn't come to that. Lyanna stood at the side, silent, her thoughts whirling. Daenerys had recognized her name from the old rebellion. How could she not? That war had begun when Rhaegar took Lyanna Stark from Robert Baratheon's promised bed. Now here they stood, all these years later, trying to unify Targaryen and Stark for a higher purpose. She prayed the queen would not dredge up the specifics of that tragedy. If Daenerys discovered that the child Rhaegar died for yet lived, and that Ned Stark's sister had carried him all these years, how would she react? As a friend to another Targaryen, or as a rival queen threatened by another potential heir? Night fell over Dragonstone, the wind moaning around the towers. Soldiers stood guard outside their doors, preventing them from wandering freely. Lyanna tried to sleep on a narrow cot in her assigned chamber, but her mind raced. She envisioned dragons and undead clashing, the storm of ice and fire that Rhaegar had once foreseen. If the realm was not prepared, all would be lost. Finally, near midnight, she rose and slipped into the corridor. Jon's chamber was only a few doors away. 2 unsullied guards blocked the hall, spears crossed. She approached, and they stared at her with blank discipline. She spoke softly. "I need to speak to Lord Commander Snow." The guards did not move. She repeated herself. Still, they remained silent. A moment later, the door opened from within. Jon stood there, wearing only a loose tunic, hair disheveled. He looked at the guards, then at Lyanna, realizing she must want a word. "It's all right," he told the guards. "She's my kin. Let her pass." After a tense pause, they let Lyanna enter. Jon shut the door behind her. She turned, studying his tired eyes in the glow of a single candle. "I couldn't sleep," she murmured. He sighed. "Nor I. My thoughts race. We're so close to forging something crucial, and yet everything is precarious." She sank onto a small bench against the wall, resting her elbows on her knees. "Jon, if Daenerys keeps us here, questions will arise. Melisandre recognized me from the wall. The Red Priestess might know more than we think. She might sense your lineage." Jon paced the small space. "If she does, she hasn't said so. She spoke once of me as some prophesied figure, but I never trusted her omens. I only wish we had clearer proof of the White Walkers to show Daenerys. Dragonglass, yes, but she might demand more. Perhaps we should bring her a captive white. Though that seems mad." Lyanna rubbed her temples. "Mad, but it might be the only way. A living, if you can call it living, white might force her to believe." She paused, glancing up. "But capturing one means returning north beyond the wall." Jon stood there, tension in every line of his posture. "Would you come with me? Back into that darkness?" he asked softly. She nodded without hesitation. "I will not leave you, Jon, no matter how dark the path becomes. As long as I breathe, I will stand by you." He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of warmth amidst the weariness. "I am grateful," he said, voice quiet. "You've sacrificed so much already." Lyanna shook her head. "I would have sacrificed more. If only the realm had listened sooner. If only we had the peace Rhaegar dreamed of. But regrets are useless now. We do what we must." Outside, the wind hissed. Somewhere above, she heard the distant cry of a dragon echo across the night sky, an eerie, piercing call that set her nerves on edge. She rose, feeling a chill despite the closed windows. "I should return to my chamber. The guards might not be pleased I linger here." She squeezed Jon's hand briefly. "Try to sleep if you can." He managed a slight nod, though she doubted he would find rest any more than she could. She slipped back into the corridor. The unsullied guards looked at her impassively as she returned to her room. Closing the door behind her, she leaned against the cold black stone. She willed herself to find the calm that eluded her, to gather strength for the morning when they would once again face Daenerys Targaryen and plead their case. If it failed, if the queen refused to believe, they would be left with no allies against the darkness. At dawn, a messenger in Targaryen livery summoned them to the Great Hall. They gathered, rearming themselves discreetly, though the guards insisted they leave blades behind. Jon carried no weapon save his wits. Tormund grumbled, but complied. The watchman hung back, letting Jon and Lyanna lead. Ghost padded at Jon's side, low growls rumbling whenever a soldier drew too close. In the hall, Daenerys awaited them again, perched on her stone throne with regal poise. Melisandre stood to one side, her red robes shimmering. Another figure stood by the queen, a man with a lined face and mismatched attire, half smiling. Lyanna guessed he might be the rumored spymaster Varys the Spider. The queen's dragons were absent from the hall this time, which was either a sign of trust or a sign that Daenerys saw no need to impress them further with displays of power. Jon bowed. Lyanna inclined her head. Tormund merely gave a curt nod, earning a glare from some of the queen's guards. Daenerys leaned forward. "Lord Commander Snow, Lyanna Stark, you have had a night to rest. I have conferred with my advisors. They tell me the Night's Watch has indeed faced unusual threats, that the Boltons have brutalized the North, and that the Iron Throne remains in the grip of my enemy, Cersei Lannister. You ask me to believe in White Walkers and Whites. While I have seen many wonders, my dragons among them, I have not seen this undead menace, nor have my scouts. Yet Melisandre speaks of a great war against darkness." She gestured to the Red Priestess, who kept her eerie smile. Jon's voice was steady. "Your Grace, I do not blame you for doubt. The living have not faced this threat in thousands of years. But it is real. We fought them at Hardhome. They overran us and would have marched on Castle Black if the wall hadn't held." Daenerys considered him. "You want me to bring my armies north, to risk them in a land that may not even welcome me. What would you offer in return?" "I want the Iron Throne, the realm that was my family's by blood. Are the Northern Lords willing to bend the knee?" Lyanna's heart pounded. The conversation had come to that. Jon paused, uncertain. "Your Grace, my vow is to the Night's Watch. I have no power to speak for the North in matters of fealty, but I can tell you that if the living fall to the dead, no throne will matter. We need your dragons as a weapon of fire against creatures of ice. We need an alliance of all who still draw breath." A hush fell. Then Daenerys spoke softly, her tone measured. "I admire your dedication, but I am not in the habit of sending my forces based on rumor. Would you show me proof?" Jon nodded. "If proof is what you require, then let me bring it. Let me capture a white from beyond the wall and place it before you. Once you see it with your own eyes, you will know I speak truth, and we can stand together." Varys and the other advisors exchanged glances. Daenerys's mouth quirked slightly. "A bold plan, and a dangerous one, is it not? Journeying into the frozen wastes to snatch a monster of ice? How will you even bring it here?" Jon answered, carefully, "But it is our only chance. If my vow to the Watch forbids me from bending the knee, I can still pledge to fight for you against the Lannisters, once the threat from the North is quelled. The North needs a free realm, and you need peace behind you to march on King's Landing. Together we could forge that peace." Silence stretched. Melisandre's lips parted in a strange smile, as though she heard secrets in the flames. Daenerys, for her part, eyed Jon and Lyanna with an almost searching gaze, as if suspecting deeper currents. At last she spoke. "Very well. Bring me one of these creatures. Show me that the threat is real. If you succeed, I will commit my dragons and my armies to the fight against the dead. If you fail—" She let the words hang. "I will see you again, Lord Snow, and you, Lyanna Stark, who returned from the grave. Time will tell if you are truly friend or foe." It was not a cheerful acceptance, but it was the best they could hope for. Jon inclined his head. Lyanna did the same, her breath unsteady. The first major step had been taken. Daenerys had not thrown them in chains, nor unleashed her dragons upon them. That alone was a victory in this precarious world. They were dismissed, and As they left the hall, Tormund muttered, "So we're to go back north into the mouth of death, just to grab one of those rotting corpses? Sounds mad." Jon's eyes were grim. "It is, but it might be our only hope of convincing the realm to unite." Lyanna walked beside him, heart pounding. They would go back beyond the wall, back into the realm of the dead. She recalled the terror she had felt the night they fought at Castle Black, the shrieking swirl of undead and the bitter cold that froze the blood. She had sworn she would follow Jon anywhere, yet fear gnawed at her. Still, if it might save them from a far worse fate, she would do it. She had risked her life to bring Jon into the world. She would risk it again to protect the world he inhabited. They retreated to their chambers, gathering their belongings. Daenerys seemed to have no intention of holding them captive, but she also offered no more hospitality than necessary. A slender young woman arrived with a small coffer containing a few dragonglass daggers and arrowheads, an unspoken gesture from the queen. They also found, waiting in a side corridor, a man who identified himself as Davos Seaworth, once in service to Stannis Baratheon. Davos had come to Dragonstone recently, hearing of Daenerys' arrival. He recognized Jon from the stories of the Battle of the Wall and quickly offered to help them, remembering that Ned Stark's sense of honor had once impressed him. "I've seen the dead, and I've lost men to them," Davos said quietly. "I'll stand with you if you'll have me." Jon gladly accepted his aid. So they found themselves leaving Dragonstone the next day with a small band including Davos, Tormund, a few watchmen, and Ghost. Lyanna felt the eyes of Daenerys' soldiers upon them as they descended the steps to the harbor. She wondered if the queen watched from a tower window. There was no turning back from the vow Jon had made. They had to seize a white and bring it south in chains. The mere thought made her dizzy with dread. But the realm depended on them. They secured a small skiff, courtesy of Davos's connections, and set out for the mainland again, leaving behind the fortress of Dragonstone and the swirling questions that lay coiled in its black corridors. Their path would lead them back across Westeros, back to the wall, and beyond into the icy shadows. Lyanna clutched the railing of the boat, her gaze on Jon's determined profile. She whispered a silent plea to the old gods to guide them. Rhaegar had once spoken of a song of ice and fire, the harmony of two great powers that might save the world or destroy it. Lyanna had lived her life on the cusp of that prophecy, bearing within her a child of both lines. Now that child was sailing away, determined to chain the dead themselves to prove the threat was real. She prayed that was enough. She prayed they all had the strength to face what awaited them in the land of eternal winter. The skiff cut through the waves, leaving Dragonstone's looming towers behind. Salt spray danced across the bow. Jon stood at the prow, cloak flapping, Ghost by his side. Lyanna watched him, marveling at the quiet resolve that had come to define him. Though he carried the name Snow, though the realm still knew him only as Ned Stark's bastard, he bore within him the living memory of both Stark and Targaryen, winter and summer, ice and fire. If there was any hope of uniting the Seven Kingdoms to stand against the dead, he was that hope. Lyanna vowed she would see him prevail or die trying. She closed her eyes and breathed in the cold sea air. The next steps of their journey would be the most dangerous yet. They would return to the place she once thought of as her prison and her refuge, the Wall. Beyond it, the White Walkers waited in the endless night. But Lyanna Stark, who had defied kings and prophecy and time itself, would not falter. She opened her eyes again, shoulders set. The battle was only just beginning, and she would stand with Jon until the bitter end, or until the dawn broke anew over a realm saved from darkness. They returned to the mainland in a small skiff, the worn hull creaking with every slap of the waves. Lyanna kept close to Jon, holding the wooden rail as the boat rocked. Wind gusted in from the east, carrying salt and the tang of far-off storms. Behind them, Dragonstone's volcanic towers jutted against the gray sky, a fortress of black stone shaped by Targaryen might. Though they had achieved a sort of diplomatic success there, forging an uneasy bargain with Daenerys Targaryen, it weighed on them that the queen demanded proof of the undead threat, a living wight brought south to demonstrate the reality of the long night. Lyanna had once thought no plan could be madder than smuggling her infant child away from a war. But this venturing beyond the wall to drag back a creature of icy death seemed the darkest gamble yet. Jon squinted at the ragged coastline ahead, his face carved by tension and salted wind. Ghost, perched unsteadily in the prow, let out a low noise of displeasure. One of the fishermen pulled hard on the oars, muttering to his partner about ill omens. Tormund Giantsbane, jammed into the back of the skiff with 2 Night's Watch Rangers, looked pale from seasickness. Davos Seaworth had come as well, offering his help and knowledge of these southern shores. They were a disparate band, each burdened by memories and secrets. When they reached the rocky beach, the skiff scraped and bumped aground. Lyanna disembarked gingerly, a coil of anxiety twisted in her stomach. Traveling back north through a land still tangled in war could provoke trouble at every turn. They had no illusions. Cersei Lannister sat the Iron Throne, jealously guarding her hold on the south. The Boltons remained in Winterfell, clinging to ill-gotten power. The realm was fractured into a half-dozen factions. What place did the Night's Watch or a presumed dead Stark woman have in such turmoil? Yet this mission overshadowed all. The dead were coming, and they would not stop for petty politics. Davos oversaw payment to the fishermen, ensuring they were compensated for braving Dragonstone's waters. Then he turned to Jon, wiping sweat from his brow. "We'll need horses. This region might be prowled by Lannister patrols, but if we keep off the main roads, we can head north in decent time. I've traveled these parts before in service to Stannis." Jon nodded. "We can't risk riding all the way to King's Landing. We'll keep to the countryside. Once we reach the Rose Road or the King's Road, we can slip behind farmland and, with luck, avoid major armies." Tormund spat out a mouthful of sour spit. "Your kingdoms have too many roads and too many lords. Free folk travel on their own 2 feet without all this fuss." Davos gave him a wry half-smile. "That might be, but the faster we reach the north, the better." Lyanna noted that Tormund, for all his complaining, had proven himself a steadfast ally. Where once free folk and Night's Watch had been enemies, the threat of the dead had reforged them into something close to brothers. Some nights, Lyanna wondered what her father, Rickard Stark, would have thought of a wildling champion traveling alongside a Stark and a handful of black brothers. That era of old loyalties and old enmities was gone, consumed by a war that threatened the living itself. They found a small fishing hamlet several miles inland where battered huts clustered around a shallow stream. In exchange for coin, the local fisherfolk pointed them to a mossy stable that had once belonged to a minor house. The stable stood half-ruined, but within were 4 half-starved horses, their hides patchy. By combining their remaining gold with Davos's meager stash, and by trading a few casks of salted fish brought from the boat, they managed to buy the horses along with 2 donkeys for carrying supplies. Tormund eyed the thin animals with dismay. "I'd sooner ride a dead goat," he grumbled, but he relented. Each day of delay would allow the undead threat to grow. As dusk settled, they set up a crude camp away from the hamlet, not wanting to provoke further questions. A single sickle moon hung over the horizon, the sky streaked with red. Lyanna sat near the fire, pulling her cloak tight against the chill. Ghost prowled the perimeter, his white fur drifting in and out of the murk. Jon crouched beside Lyanna, quietly turning a piece of driftwood in his hands. "Mother," he said at length, his voice hushed so the others would not overhear. "I was thinking about the Queen's words. She recognized your name. I saw how she looked at you when you first introduced yourself as Lyanna Stark." Lyanna nodded, remembering the searching gaze in Daenerys's violet eyes. "She knows the history, no doubt. My disappearance sparked Robert's rebellion. To her, I must be the woman whose name echoes in Targaryen ruin. I fear she might guess something more if she grows curious." Jon's jaw tightened. "And if she does? If she learns you bore Rhaegar's child?" He swallowed. "I don't know how she'd react. She might see me as a threat to her claim." Lyanna reached out, laying a hand on Jon's forearm. "We will keep it hidden as long as we can. Should it come to light, we must pray she places the survival of the realm above dynastic conflict. There is too much at stake to splinter ourselves in petty feuds. A war with the dead demands every living soul who can fight." Jon nodded, though his eyes glimmered with uncertainty. "We must succeed in capturing a white. If we fail, none of this will matter anyway." They spoke no more of it. The group soon turned in for the night, the horses tied to a nearby tree. The watch alternated between Tormund and one of Jon's rangers. Lyanna wrapped herself in a blanket. The ground was damp beneath her, but she managed to drift into a shallow sleep, haunted by half-formed dreams of winter storms and a rising tide of corpses. She woke before dawn to the sound of distant thunder and found Jon already stirring, quietly gathering the few provisions they had. She gave him a tired smile, and they prepared to ride north. They spent the next weeks in a constant half-secret trek through the war-weary crownlands and riverlands. The roads were dotted with broken caravans, burned farms, and skeletal remains of conflict. They saw few major forces, but patrols from House Lannister occasionally roved, recognizable by their crimson cloaks. Once or twice, they heard rumor of mounted knights in golden armor harassing villages suspected of aiding Daenerys Targaryen. Lyanna, Jon, and their companions took pains to avoid direct confrontation, for fighting a band of seasoned knights would only slow them. Their goal lay in the far north. In one half-destroyed village near the Blackwater Rush, they encountered frightened smallfolk who recognized Jon's black cloak. At first, they shrank away, uncertain if the Watch were allies or new tormentors. Jon tried to reassure them that the Night's Watch took no sides in the realm's petty wars. Over time, the villagers relaxed enough to share stale bread and muddy water from a well. A gray-haired woman told them that the Lannister army had marched west toward Highgarden, leaving scattered outriders behind. Another man, missing an eye, said that King's Landing had grown more dangerous. Queen Cersei's men took inordinate taxes and punished any suspected traitor with savage reprisals. Tormund shook his head in dismay, calling it madness among the Kneelers. They pressed on. The weather turned foul, with cold rain that turned the roads to mud. Their horses floundered, half-starved. More than once, they had to dismount and lead them on foot, forging slow progress. Lyanna's cloak grew sodden, and her boots caked in muck. Still, she did not complain. She had endured worse journeys in her life. She thought of the Tower of Joy, her delirious flight with a newborn, the precarious trek across Dorne's deserts, all for the sake of keeping Jon safe. Now she faced the mire of a war-torn realm, again for that same child, though he was fully grown and leading them all. They avoided major towns like Harrenhal, crossing the Trident near its shallower fords. In the distance, the monstrous silhouette of Harrenhal's melted towers loomed. None of them wanted to test the castle's inhabitants. Rumor said it was half-abandoned, cursed. They encountered an influx of refugees heading north for reasons they struggled to articulate. Some had heard of the Bolton's cruelty but also dreaded Lannister rapine. Others believed rumors that the dead roamed the countryside and thought the North's emptiness might be safer. Jon tried to warn them that the threat lay far beyond the wall. Not in these lands, but the refugees had nowhere else to go. At last, after many days, they crossed into the Neck. The swampy forests and causeways leading north brought Lyanna a pang of familiarity. She remembered traveling this route decades ago as a girl, galloping beside Ned. The wars had left this region battered too, but House Reed and the Marshfolk were known to be cunning defenders. They saw no large armies, only glimpses of will-o'-wisps in the mist, and heard distant calls of creatures stirring in brackish water. Davos guided them across one half-flooded causeway, urging them to keep a slow but steady pace. Twice they nearly lost a donkey in the deeper bog. Tormund cursed the sour earth that could swallow a man's foot. On a chill morning, they finally emerged from the Neck into the wide, rolling plains of the north. Lyanna took in a lungful of crisp air, sensing the subtle shift in climate. This was her homeland, albeit scarred by war. The sky stretched bleak overhead, the sun a pale disk behind thick clouds. Jon paused his horse beside her, exchanging a look that seemed to say, "We're nearly there, but the dangers are no less." They angled their route west to avoid the area around Moat Cailin, which might still be held by Bolton or Frey forces. As they rode deeper into the north, they saw fewer signs of war but greater emptiness. Burned farmsteads, deserted villages. Winter's toll was harsh, and the Boltons rule harsher still. A few times, they spotted Bolton patrols in the distance, men wearing the Flayed Man sigil on their banners. Each time, Jon decided they should hide in copses of trees or behind hills until the patrols passed, for an open skirmish might end with the alarm raised. Lyanna seethed at the thought of these men trampling Stark lands, but reason won out. Any delay might doom the entire realm. The weather turned colder by the day. Snow flurries drifted down, dusting the roads. Tormund shrugged off the chill, used to far harsher climates, but Davos huddled in his cloak. The rangers and watchmen were silent, stoic, focusing on the journey. Lyanna found a strange sense of nostalgia in it. The North's chill, the hush of wind in the pines. She recalled teaching Jon to ride a small pony in Winterfell's courtyard, back when he was a wide-eyed boy full of curiosity. Now he was a man, leading them to face nightmares. Life had a cruel symmetry. After another week, they neared the lands around Winterfell. Even at a distance, they could see faint plumes of smoke rising from the castle's chimneys. The approach was littered with deserted fields, all lying fallow. In normal times, farmers would be harvesting the last autumn yields. These were not normal times. Once more, they took pains to skirt wide around the seat of House Stark, for it remained under Bolton control. From a vantage atop a ridge, Lyanna glimpsed the high gray walls of her childhood home, recognized the shape of the towers. A wave of sorrow washed over her. She could not guess what atrocities Ramsay Bolton had committed behind those walls. But it was not their mission to retake Winterfell now. The living had bigger foes than even the Boltons. They turned northeast, pushing for the King's Road that led toward Castle Black. The snow deepened day by day, swirling in the wind. Their battered horses trudged on, half lame. At a certain point, Tormund and Jon decided they might make better time on foot, but the animals still carried their supplies, so they persevered. One frosty night, they made camp in the lee of a rocky outcropping. The wind howled over the plains, turning their breath to white vapor. Jon helped gather brush for a small fire, then took a seat near Lyanna. Tormund, Davos, and a handful of rangers circled round, sharing what little food remained. The others spoke in low tones about the perils ahead, while Lyanna and Jon quietly conferred. "We should reach Castle Black in 2 more days if the weather holds," Jon said, hugging his cloak around him. "I only hope we're not too late." The last we knew, Ed Tollett was manning it with a skeleton garrison. The rest of the watch might be at Eastwatch or Shadow Tower, depending on the wildling movements. Lyanna nodded, letting the firelight dance across her features. "We'll need to muster a small band to go beyond the wall. The smaller the group, the less likely we'll be overwhelmed if we move carefully. But capturing a white, we'll need chain, strong men, and a bit of luck from the old gods." "It's madness, Jon." He gave a bitter half-smile. "Madness, yes. Yet if it convinces Daenerys and the realm, it might be worth the price." They sat in silence for a moment. Lyanna thought of Rhaegar Targaryen's words about the prince who was promised. Was this the shape of that prophecy? Her son leading men into mortal peril to save an entire continent? She did not believe in prophecy easily, but she believed in Jon's will to protect the living. That might be enough. Snow fell steadily through the night. By dawn, drifts had formed around their camp. The horses huffed clouds, stamping their hooves. The group packed up and pressed on, forging north with heads bowed against the cold. The day passed in white blur. Lyanna lost track of time. Her limbs ached. Only the knowledge that Castle Black lay ahead kept her moving. As dusk approached, the snow lessened, revealing a last stretch of the King's Road leading into a wide, barren swath known as the Gift, land that once provided for the Night's Watch. At the horizon, they glimpsed the wall at last, a colossal shimmer of white-blue ice that seemed to stretch across the entire world. Lyanna's breath caught as she saw the ramparts near Castle Black. She remembered leaving that fortress not so long ago, full of hope that Daenerys Targaryen might join their cause. How many times, she thought, will we pass through these gates, uncertain if we'll return? The gates of Castle Black came into view, along with a few watchfires flickering on the ramparts. A horn blast echoed faintly across the ice, signaling the arrival of travelers. Jon raised a hand in greeting. Soon, the massive wooden gate began to open, and a small party of black-cloaked men emerged. At their head, Lyanna recognized Dolorous Ed Tollett, now effectively in command in Jon's absence, though Jon still held the title of Lord Commander. Ed's face brightened with relief at seeing Jon alive, though his expression remained as dour as ever. "Jon," he said flatly, "we thought you drowned on the far side of the world, or been roasted by dragons, or impaled on a Lannister spear, but here you are. Good. I was running out of excuses to keep the men from naming me Lord Commander for good. I do an awful job of it." Jon allowed a faint laugh. "It's good to see you too, Ed. It's a long story. Let's just say we've got more trouble ahead." Ed sighed. "We always do. Come in, all of you. The Wall's hospitality isn't grand, but it beats freezing to death out here." He peered at Lyanna, giving a small nod. "Lady Lyanna, welcome back." They filed in through the gate. Ghost bounded Ahea. Happy to be on familiar ground. The courtyard was quieter than usual, with only a handful of black brothers about. Many had gone east or west or died in battles with the dead. The men that remained were exhausted, half-starved, but still resolute. Lyanna's heart twisted at the memory of that terrible assault they had weathered months ago. Bodies piled against the gates, the shrieks of undead beyond the ice. The respite was only temporary. Inside the common hall, Ed arranged a simple meal of bread, onions, and thin stew. The hall felt cavernous with so many benches empty. As Jon and the newcomers ate, Ed and a few loyal watchmen listened to their tale, how they had gone to Dragonstone, parleyed with Daenerys Targaryen, and won her conditional support if they could bring proof of the undead threat. Ed's brow wrinkled with each revelation. "So the queen with dragons demands a living corpse?" He shook his head. "I've seen my share of corpses in the north, none I'd care to bring home as a pet. But if that's what it takes to save us all, can't say I'm surprised. Men from the south rarely believe anything until it bites off their face." Jon leaned forward. "We'll organize a small party. The best of the Rangers, those who've survived beyond the wall. We know the whites roam in pockets. If we can isolate just one, kill the others and haul it back." "Madness," Ed grumbled. "Still, I can't think of a better plan. I'll gather the men who might volunteer. Some are out with Tally, searching for sign of wildling stragglers. They should be back in 2 days. We're stretched thin, Jon. Very thin." Tormund clapped a hand on Ed's shoulder. "We've got free folk who might help. The Great War is for all of us, you Black Cloak lumps and us free folk. Let me go to Eastwatch. My people are scattered there." Ed frowned. Eastwatch was badly hit. "The wildlings who remain are a tough lot, but I hear a group marched off north again, claiming they had to find their kin. Hard to keep track of them." "We'll find them," Tormund said firmly, "or we'll find enough to help." After more discussion, it was agreed that Tormund, plus a few watchmen, would travel to Eastwatch the following morning. Jon would remain at Castle Black for a few days, mustering volunteers and preparing gear. Lyanna listened in silence, arms folded. She saw the exhaustion in Jon's eyes, the weight of leadership he never had the luxury to refuse. He had expected to remain a simple brother of the Watch, but war had thrust a lord's mantle upon him, just as tragedy and necessity had once thrust motherhood upon her when she was hardly more than a girl. She reached out under the table, lightly squeezing Jon's wrist. He glanced at her and managed a small, grateful smile. They retired to meager quarters for the night. Lyanna returned to the same narrow chamber she had used before, a simple cot and a single flickering candle. The familiarity was oddly calming. She took off her boots, massaging her sore ankles, and closed her eyes. She imagined the days to come, venturing beyond the wall once more, stepping into the heart of Winter's domain. She had done so once, but never so far, never with the goal of capturing a white. Fear tried to coil around her heart, but she fought it. This was for the realm, for Jon, for all living souls who deserved a chance to see another spring. In the morning, Tormund, Davos, and half a dozen watchmen set out for Eastwatch. The plan was for them to see if any wildlings or black brothers there would join the expedition. "Jon, Lyanna, and Ed stayed behind to coordinate supplies. The entire castle felt subdued, overshadowed by the knowledge of what was coming. They had so little time before the others could gather their strength for another assault. Lyanna helped Ed check the armory. Though the watch possessed some dragonglass arrowheads, sent from Dragonstone, they were in short supply. Longclaw, Jon's Valyrian steel sword, was one of the few truly potent weapons against White Walkers. The rest would have to rely on obsidian or the improvised arms they had. Over the next 2 days, small groups of watchmen trickled back to Castle Black, responding to Ed's summons. They looked weary, some bearing frostbitten fingers or arrow wounds from wildling skirmishes. Yet when they heard Jon Snow needed volunteers to venture beyond the wall, they swallowed their fear. They recalled Hardhome or the corpses that had once attacked the castle. Men who had never believed in legends now knew all too well that the dead walked. A half-dozen rangers stepped forward, men like Garth Stoneborn, an older brother with a crippled ear, and Bennis of the Fens, whose face was pocked with old scars. They pledged to follow Jon anywhere if it meant a chance to protect the realm. None of them seemed eager. They simply recognized the necessity. By the third day, Tormund and Davos returned with a small band of wildlings from Eastwatch, about 10 men and women, rough and grim-faced. One was a powerful spearwife with a battered wooden shield strapped to her back. Another was a lean hunter who carried a short bow of horn and sinew. They recognized Tormund as one of the Free Folk's leaders and gave Jon and Lyanna cautious nods. A few black brothers from Eastwatch came, too. One was a tall youth named Harrion, barely old enough to shave. Another was a one-eyed veteran called Red Jaime. None of them flinched at hearing the plan. They already knew what horror lurked beyond the wall. Altogether, the party that would go in search of a white numbered around 20 souls. Lyanna counted them in the courtyard as they finalized preparations. It was a paltry force, but any larger group risked drawing the entire undead horde. Stealth and speed would be crucial. They would need sturdy mules or garrons to help haul the chains and crates for transporting a captured white, as well as enough dragonglass weapons to hold off lesser undead. Lyanna quietly insisted on joining. Jon tried to dissuade her, said it was too dangerous, that she might do more good staying at Castle Black to coordinate or stand as a stark presence if something happened to him. But she refused, her resolve unbending. "Jon, I will not wait behind, fretting over your fate," she said fiercely. "We have come this far together. I have faced the dead once before at your side. I will stand with you now." He pressed his lips into a grim line but did not challenge her further. Perhaps he recognized the same determination he'd once shown in going to Hardhome, the same stubborn sense of duty. She was his mother, and if she had taught him anything, it was that she would never abandon him when the stakes were highest. They set out at dawn, the air biting cold. The gates of Castle Black opened, revealing the vast expanse of tundra and ice beyond the wall. Even in daytime, the light felt flat and distant, the sky a heavy gray. The watchmen, wildlings, and volunteers each wore thick furs over chainmail or boiled leather. Ed was there to see them off, an expression of deep worry on his long face. He clutched Jon's arm in farewell, then clasped Lyanna's hand. "Good luck, my lady," he said quietly. "Don't let him do anything stupid." Lyanna forced a faint laugh. "I'll try. Take care, Ed." They stepped out onto the old path that led north from the wall. Snow crunched underfoot. Tormund led the vanguard, trudging ahead with a huge two-handed axe slung across his back. Jon walked near the center, guiding a sturdy garron laden with ropes and chains. Lyanna moved beside him, a dragonglass-tipped spear in her hand. Davos hovered near the rear, scanning the horizon with anxious eyes. Ghost prowled on their flank, muzzle lifted to the wind. The wind sliced across the icy plain, stinging Lyanna's cheeks until they felt numb. Each breath she took felt like knives in her lungs. They pressed on. Low hills rose and fell, dotted with scraggly brush that survived the cold. Now and then, they came upon old remains of a wildling camp. Fire pits filled with char, scraps of bone, a scattering of footprints. Some were weeks or months old. Others appeared more recent. They saw no living souls, Only the crows sometimes circled overhead, cawing bleakly in the emptiness. They marched for 2 days into the wilderness, each night huddling against rocks or in shallow ravines for shelter. On the 3rd day, they entered a stretch of higher crags and deep gullies. Tormund called it the Fist of the Frostfangs, though it was not the same site as the ill-fated expedition led by the Watch's Lord Commander Mormont years past. Some said pockets of undead still roamed near that place. Their plan was to find a smaller group of whites on the prowl, isolate one, and haul it south. A plan easier said than done. The tension rose with each passing hour. They all knew one misstep could alert a larger mass of the undead or, worse, draw a White Walker. Despite being armed with dragonglass, the Watchers harbored no illusions. A single White Walker could slaughter half their party if fortune turned ill. Lyanna prayed to the old gods for a sign, for some clue. Her breath formed plumes in the frigid air, and each step in the snow felt heavier. Memories of the Tower of Joy flickered in her mind, of the scorching heat and dusty stones. That world of sun and warmth seemed impossibly far away now. It was late afternoon when they came upon footprints, human footprints but stiffened with ice. The hunter from Eastwatch, a lanky man called Scad, knelt to examine them. "These ain't living feet," he muttered grimly. "But looks like only a handful, maybe half a dozen." Tormund's eyes gleamed. "Whites, we follow." Quietly, Jon signaled for the group to proceed with utmost caution. They fanned out, weapons at the ready, each breath a hushed exhalation. Lyanna's nerves were taut. She kept close to Jon, glancing at the sky. Thick clouds threatened more snow, but for now, visibility remained decent, if dim and gray. They moved from rock to rock, keeping low. Once or twice, Ghost gave a soft growl. Then, cresting a small ridge, they saw them. 5 shambling silhouettes about 100 yards off, lurching across the snowy ground. The whites wore tattered furs or rotted tunics. One dragged a ragged bit of chain behind it, clanking softly. All had flesh blackened or peeled away in places, their eyes empty, their movements stiff yet unervingly relentless. The Watchers froze, hearts thudding. Jon signaled for the others to circle around, forming a loose net. They had to isolate one white. Tormund and a pair of wildlings took the left flank, creeping behind boulders. Davos and a ranger named Bennis moved wide to the right. Lyanna and Jon hovered near the center with 3 other rangers and the Garen carrying chains. The plan was to wait until the whites were close enough, then strike swiftly, destroying 4 while subduing the last with dragonglass wounds that might slow it but not kill it entirely. If that was even possible. The whites trudged onward, oblivious or uncaring, until they were maybe 30 yards away. Lyanna could see the ragged bits of hair clinging to one's skull, the black, shrunken lips drawn back from bared teeth. She forced down the wave of nausea. "We cannot fail. For the living, we must do this." Jon gripped Longclaw, his face pale with determination. Tormund leapt first, letting out a roar to draw their attention, bounding over the rocks. The whites jerked around, hissing with unnatural fury. Jon bellowed, "Now!" The Watchers surged forward from all sides. Steel clashed against undead flesh. One of the whites lunged at Tormund, rotted fingers reaching. Tormund cleaved it in half with a savage blow, but the creature's upper torso kept crawling, bony hands clawing at his ankles. A wildling spearwife stabbed it through the skull with dragonglass, causing it to collapse into a twitching heap that disintegrated into shards of blackened ice and dusty bone. Jon confronted another white, which swung a rusted hatchet. He parried with Longclaw, slicing it diagonally across the spine. The white staggered but still fought, so Jon rammed dragonglass into its chest. That proved enough to break the magic animating it. The body crumpled in a cloud of foul dust. Lyanna stabbed a third white from behind, driving her spear into its back. She felt a jolt, like cold electricity, shoot through her arms as the creature screeched. She twisted the spear free. With a last rasping snarl, it dissolved. Only 2 remained, the chain-dragging white and a shorter one in a moth-eaten cloak. Bennis the ranger tackled the short white, driving it down into the snow. The white raked at his face, nearly tearing out his eye, until Davos jabbed a dragonglass dagger through its temple. That left the chain-dragging wight alone, thrashing and swinging the chain wildly. His face was half-eaten by decay, teeth clacking. Jon shouted, "Don't kill it! Take it!" But the wight lashed out, striking one of the watchers in the chest with the chain. The man stumbled, crying out. Lyanna and Jon rushed in, flanking the wight. It hissed, turning first to Jon, chain raised, then snapping back toward Lyanna. She ducked the chain blow, nearly losing her footing on the slick ground. Jon stepped in, slashing a deep cut across the wight's back but avoiding a death blow. The wight shuddered, blackened ichor seeping from the wound. Tormund joined them, trying to grab the chain, and succeeded in tangling the wight's arms for an instant. "Now!" Tormund roared. Lyanna lunged with her spear, aiming for a spot that might cripple its leg without letting it crumble into dust. She managed to pierce through the rotted sinews of the thigh, but the wight shrieked, flailing in her direction. Suddenly, the wight's free hand closed around Lyanna's spear haft, yanking her off balance. She toppled sideways, crashing into the snow. Jon launched himself forward, hooking the wight's arm with long claw, severing it at the elbow. The severed limb flopped about like a nightmarish spider. The wight tried to surge toward Lyanna, but Tormund tackled it from behind, pinning it face down. The watchers scrambled in with the heavy chain, roping its torso and legs. The shrieking, thrashing creature flailed, spattering foul fluid. Another watchman hammered a dragonglass spike into its back. Shallow enough not to kill it, but enough, they hoped, to keep it weakened. Lyanna scrambled away, heart hammering, cold sweat on her brow. She picked up her spear. The wight bucked and howled, jaws snapping. Jon and Tormund wrestled it into a specially prepared wooden crate. Bennis kicked the severed limb inside as well. Then they slammed the crate shut, hammered in iron nails, and wrapped the entire box in extra chains. The wight pounded inside, letting out guttural shrieks, but it could not break free. A vile stench hovered in the air. They stood panting in the snow. Tormund's beard was flecked with black gore. Davos pulled Bennis aside, checking the deep scratches on the ranger's arms. The man winced, but it appeared more superficial than mortal. Another watchman lay still in the snow. He had been struck in the head by the chain and was unconscious, breathing shallowly. Lyanna knelt, helping to bind his wound with a rag. She hoped he would live. The entire skirmish had lasted less than a minute, but it felt like an eternity. Jon wiped sweat from his brow, though the air was freezing. "We have it," he breathed, staring at the crate. The wight's shrieks echoed inside. "Now we must return south, quickly, before something else finds us." They gathered the wounded, performed a few hasty checks, then hoisted the crate onto the Garen's back. The poor beast reared in panic at the undead stench, nearly toppling them all. Eventually, they managed to tether the crate securely with the chains. The watchers formed a protective ring around the beast. Each minute that passed brought the possibility that a larger undead force might appear, or worse, a White Walker. None wanted to linger. They set off the way they had come, forging quickly back toward Castle Black. Every so often, the crate shook violently, and the wight's muffled howls renewed. The living men tried to ignore it. Lyanna felt her stomach twist at the monstrous cargo. But it was exactly what they needed to show the Southern Lords and Daenerys Targaryen that the threat was real. Night fell, forcing them to camp in a narrow ravine where they set a perimeter of watchers. The shrieks from the crate subsided into a rasping hiss, but no one dared open it even a crack. Lyanna did not sleep. She sat by a dying fire, arms around her knees, every muscle taut. Jon eventually slid down beside her, exhaustion lining his face. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're trembling," he said softly. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, letting out a ragged breath. "No, just thinking how insane this is. That thing, we're carrying it like a cursed trophy, and we must present it to a queen. Gods help us if it somehow breaks loose among the southern courts." Jon's face was grim. "We'll keep it locked and guarded. But yes, it's dangerous. so is failing to warn the realm. We do what we must. She closed her eyes, leaning against him for warmth. In another life, she might have been a quiet lady at Winterfell, caring for her children in peace. Instead, she was here, knee-deep in snow beyond the wall, mother to the man who led a desperate mission to save humanity. Perhaps this was always her fate. Perhaps this was the shape of prophecy. They reached Castle Black again in 3 more days, traveling with all the speed they could manage. Through the swirling snow, Lyanna made out the dark line of the wall, its immensity humbling as ever. Ed and the watchmen on duty were stunned to see them return so quickly, hauling a rattling crate from which unearthly hisses emerged. Ed tried to maintain his usual fatalistic humor, but could not hide his shock. 7 bloody hells, he muttered as Jon and Tormund wrestled the crate into a secure storeroom. I thought you'd come back empty-handed or not at all. Now you bring that thing. I can feel the cold off it. Jon turned to him. We can't keep it here any longer than we must. We march south immediately. Ed hesitated. If you're taking it to the Targaryen Queen, you'll have to pass Winterfell, White Harbor, maybe even the King's Road. That's a long journey with that beast. And the Boltons. We'll go by way of Eastwatch, Jon said. We still have friends among the wildlings and old Mormont sailors. Perhaps we can sail from Eastwatch to White Harbor. Lord Manderley might help again, or we can continue down the coast. We could also sail directly for Dragonstone, but the route might be dangerous with Lannister and Ironborn ships. Davos spoke up. Best to go to White Harbor. Lord Manderley can keep things discreet. Find us a sturdy ship that can carry the crate without incident. Then we can sail for King's Landing or Dragonstone, whichever is best. The Queen might be at war in the Crownlands by now, if the rumors are true. Lyanna glanced at the crate, which rattled ominously. We should lose no time, then. They stayed only 1 night in Castle Black, tending the wounded man who remained unconscious but alive. Jon ordered extra men to remain vigilant, in case the White Walkers retaliated. Then, at first light, they started for Eastwatch, guiding their monstrous cargo with care. The distance to Eastwatch was some 100 miles of rugged coastline, battered by freezing winds. Many of the Watchers parted ways, some too injured or too shaken to continue. In the end, only around 12 accompanied Jon, Lyanna, Tormund, Davos, and Ghost. They pressed east with grim determination. The journey to Eastwatch took 5 days. Snow and ice dogged them the entire route, but the weather never rose to full blizzard. They sometimes glimpsed the dark sea to their right, waves crashing against jagged rocks. Once, they encountered a group of free folk camped by a frozen stream, but these wildlings fled at the sight of the crate, fearing it contained some cursed beast or trap. Tormund called after them, but they refused to listen. At last, Eastwatch by the sea appeared through a haze of sea spray and blowing snow. A fortress of pale stone huddled against the wall's eastern terminus, watchtowers battered by constant gales. Tall wooden palisades braced the seaward side. Smoke rose from within, meaning some portion of the watch or free folk still occupied it. They approached, raising no banners, simply calling out that they were friends and black brothers. After a tense pause, the gates creaked open. Inside, the fortress was in no better shape than Castle Black, its courtyard half filled with drifting snow and old debris. A handful of watchmen and wildlings stared warily at the newcomers. The officer in charge, a balding man named Karen, greeted Jon with surprise. He had heard rumors that Jon Snow was traveling with Tormund and a Stark woman, but he never expected to see them arrive hauling a crate that hissed and rattled. Lyanna caught sight of one watchman crossing himself at the eerie sound. Clearly, news of their mission had spread in scraps and whispers, but seeing it in person was different. Jon wasted no time, explaining they needed a ship to White Harbor. Karen's face pinched with worry. We've only a few cogs left. The rest were lost when the free folk first landed. But one might be seaworthy. A wildling crew uses it for fishing runs, though they're no master sailors. Davos exchanged a glance with Jon. We might manage with a small cog, if the weather holds. I've experience at sea, but that crate needs secure stowage, or the white could break free in rough weather. Tormund chuckled grimly. I'd pay silver to see it try to swim with half its rotted limbs. But no one truly laughed. The threat of the white was too grave to jest about for long. They set about the work of provisioning the small cog for the voyage south. The vessel, called the Ice Dancer by its wildling owner, was hardly impressive. A single-masted tub that had seen better days, with patched sails and a meager hold. But it would hold them and their cargo. Davos personally inspected the timbers, proclaiming that while the hull might leak, it would likely float well enough if the seas stayed calm. There was nothing else to choose from. Lyanna tried to steel herself for another ocean crossing, remembering how wretched the last one had been. But this time they had an even more sinister passenger. They spent a single night at Eastwatch, nailing extra boards onto the hold to create a reinforced cubicle where the crate could be chained in place. The walls were lined with dragonglass shards hammered in. Tormund joked it was like a dragonglass cage for an icy demon, but the watchers took no chances. The white hissed and banged inside the crate the entire time, as if aware that men's hands labored around it. Lyanna shuddered with every thump, worried that it might burst free. Yet the nails and chains held. At dawn they set sail. The wind cut across the shivering sea, carrying faint shards of sleet. Lyanna stood on deck beside Jon, gazing at the frozen coastline receding. Eastwatch's towers shrank behind them, and the horizon opened into gray water. The small cog creaked alarmingly, but Davos and the wildling captain coaxed it forward, trimming the sail to catch the faint breeze. The watchers hunched near the middle of the deck, away from the hold's sealed hatch, where the white's noises could be heard if one pressed an ear close. Nobody dared. The memory of hard home, of rotting faces and clawing hands, lingered in the hearts of those who had survived it. They hugged the shoreline, seeking calmer waters. The sea was choppy, but no great storms arose. Each night, they dropped anchor in sheltered coves whenever possible. The black nights were unnerving. Lyanna found herself lying awake in her cramped bunk, listening to the rasp of waves and the occasional faint scratch from below. If we sink, she thought, the white sinks with us. But that did little to ease the knot in her chest. After a full week of cautious sailing, they rounded the coast and approached the mouth of the White Knife. The going grew more complicated with shifting sandbars and swirling currents, but Davos guided them along with care. At last, the walls of White Harbor came into sight, gray stone rising from the northern mist. The sight triggered a pang of memory. The last time they had come here, Manderley had outfitted them with ships to Dragonstone. Now they returned, bearing an abomination that might shape the fate of the realm. They raised a white flag of truce, plus a makeshift signal that the local harbor guards might recognize as the Mermen of House Manderley. The watchers on the walls hesitated until Davos shouted that they came from Eastwatch with urgent news for Lord Manderley. Eventually, the harbor chain was lowered, and they navigated into the inner docks. Lyanna stood at the prow, searching for any sign of Bolton or Lannister presence. She saw only Manderley guards, all wearing the mermaid sigil on a field of green. A hush fell over the wharf as the small cog moored. Townsfolk peeked from behind crates and netting, unnerved by the grim-faced watchers and wildlings who disembarked. Tormund was the first off the plank, scowling at the stench of fish. Davos arranged for a wagon, paying a harbormaster who recognized him. With the watchers' help, they hauled the crate, still chained, still rattling, onto the dock. Onlookers stepped back with frightened gasps as the white screeched, making the boards vibrate. Some dropped their baskets, fish scattering across the wharf. Lyanna could imagine the rumors that would spread. The Night's Watch brought a monster in a box, but let them whisper. This was bigger than rumor. Guards escorted the group through White Harbor's winding streets to the new castle, Lord Manderley's seat, where they were made to wait in a wide courtyard. News had to be carried to Lord Wyman Manderley. Meanwhile, the watchers guarded the crate, scaring off any curious onlookers. Eventually, Manderley himself emerged from the keep, leaning on a cane. His girth was as great as ever, his triple chin wobbling as he studied the scene. He recognized Lyanna Stark, Jon Snow, and Davos from their previous dealings. "My friends," Manderley boomed, though worry furrowed his brow. I did not expect you to return so soon, certainly not with that. He jabbed his cane at the box. The white let out a guttural hiss, rattling the chains in answer. Jon approached, half bowing. My lord, we have accomplished a dangerous task. We captured one of the undead to prove the threat. Now we must get it south. Queen Daenerys Targaryen, and possibly all the southern lords, must see it for themselves. Manderley paled slightly at the hideous noise from the crate but mustered his composure. And you expect me to smuggle such a horror along the narrow sea? I recall the difficulties we faced even discreetly sending you to Dragonstone. This is far worse. The Lannisters hold King's Landing, do they not? And the Targaryen queen sits at Dragonstone or perhaps in open war. Warships patrol these waters. Davos nodded. We are aware, but we have no other path if we hope to unite the realm. We must sail to whichever port is safe enough that Daenerys or the southern lords can gather and witness this abomination. If the seas are too dangerous, perhaps we go by land. But that would be an even longer, riskier route, especially with the Boltons controlling the center of the north. Lord Manderley let out a heavy sigh. You do not ask for small things, Snow. But the Manderleys have always kept faith with House Stark. And you, Lady Lyanna, are indeed a Stark of the old line. As monstrous as it is, I see no other way. If the realm does not unite, the stories of Hardhome may come for us all. Lyanna dipped her head in thanks. My lord, you honor your vows and House Stark by aiding us. We will do our utmost to ensure no harm comes to your people because of this cargo. He rubbed his chin. I have a ship that might serve. The Maiden's Flood is a sturdier vessel than the ones I gave you before, though it's not a warship. If you keep out of sight, you might sail around Crackclaw Point to Dragonstone or even attempt the Blackwater if you're mad enough to parley in King's Landing. But I suspect the Targaryen queen might prefer the neutrality of Dragonstone for a demonstration. The capital is a tinderbox. Cersei might kill you all on sight. Jon glanced at Lyanna. They both recalled the tense meeting with Daenerys. If she was now at war with the Lannisters, then King's Landing was indeed a fool's errand. Dragonstone, then, Jon said. We will ask an audience there, though we cannot be sure of her presence. We can send a raven ahead. Manderley agreed. Yes, we will attempt to send word by raven, though in these times the lines of communication are uncertain. Even so, your best chance is to sail the eastern route. The Maiden's Flood can hide in small coves if you spot enemy ships. His expression turned grim. But be wary. The seas are contested. The Ironborn raid at will. The Lannisters patrol for Targaryen sympathizers. I cannot guarantee your safety once you leave White Harbor. We understand, Lyanna said, but we have little choice. Thus resolved, Lord Manderley ordered preparations. Dockworkers arrived with ropes, sails, and crates of provisions. The Watchers carefully resecured the White's box, making sure it would not jostle free in rough seas. Manderley's men hammered boards to reinforce the hold of the Maiden's Flood, forming a small locked compartment just as they had done on the Ice Dancer. The Watchers worked tirelessly in the midday sun while Manderley conferred with Davos about the route. Tormund, restless, paced the docks, glaring at passing Manderley soldiers who eyed him suspiciously. That evening, Manderley insisted on hosting them for a meal in the castle's smaller hall. He was too concerned about the monstrous cargo to stage a lavish feast, but he offered fish stew, bread, and ale. Lyanna found the warm food a relief after weeks of rough traveling. She forced herself to eat slowly, keeping her mind on the conversation. Manderley described the latest news from the south. Daenerys had indeed taken parts of the Crownlands, burning some Lannister forces with dragonfire, though Casterly Rock might remain in Lannister hands. King's Landing was locked in fear. Meanwhile, the Boltons at Winterfell had grown uneasy, hearing rumors of a returned king in the north. Some said it was Rickon Stark. Others whispered Sansa Stark had reappeared. The stories were tangled. So many rumors, Manderley sighed. It is a wonder any are true. But I care little for the smaller wars when a greater war beckons at our threshold. Lady Lyanna, I hope to live to see House Stark restored to Winterfell. I truly do. Lyanna pressed her lips together. Thank you, my lord. But first, let us make certain the living survive what is coming. He nodded, then turned to Davos. We'll have the ship ready by midday tomorrow. May the gods watch over you. If the Targaryen queen heeds your plea, perhaps there is hope. They parted ways for the night, lodging in the castle's guest quarters. By now, the watchers had grown used to bleak accommodations, so the small cots and thin blankets felt almost luxurious. Lyanna lay awake, gaze on the dim rafters. Her mind spun with the knowledge that soon they'd be back at sea, heading again for Dragonstone. She feared 1,000 disasters. Storms, pirates, Lannister galleys, ironborn reavers, the white breaking free below decks. She closed her eyes, trying to quell her heart's pounding. If the gods were merciful, they would deliver them to the queen's fortress with their cargo intact. But the gods rarely gave mercy without pain. Morning arrived draped in fog, the harbor wreathed in a swirl of mist so thick one could barely see the ships anchored a few yards away. Lord Manderley's men guided them carefully to the Maiden's Flood, a medium-sized cog with a single mast and a broader beam than the Ice Dancer. The watchers loaded supplies, along with the unnerving crate, which rattled and hissed. Sailors whispered about curses, crossing themselves as they hammered in the final nails. Manderley himself arrived to see them off, flanked by a small retinue of guards. He pressed a ring into Jon's hand, bearing the merman sigil as he had done once before, then nodded gravely to Lyanna. Good fortune. I wish we could do more, but the north is battered. Let us hope you will return with a queen and her dragons at your side. Jon bowed. If we succeed, we will owe you a great debt, my lord. If we fail, then we shall all pay a worse price. Tormund spat over the side, rolling his shoulders. Let's get on with it, then. The sea doesn't get calmer by waiting. The Maiden's Flood cast off, its sail catching a faint breeze. Fog swallowed the shoreline. Lyanna stood near the stern, watching White Harbor vanish into the gray hush. Ghost stayed close, uneasy with the rolling deck. She glanced at Jon, who stood at the helm with Davos and the wildling captain. He seemed composed, if tense. Perhaps the many trials had taught him to bury fear until later. She wished she had that skill. Instead, anxiety churned in her gut, a swirling dread that something would go wrong. For the first few days, they hugged the coast, moving slowly south along the bight. The wind was uncertain, shifting between east and west, sometimes falling dead entirely. They drifted under gray skies, the chill air nipping at exposed skin. Twice they saw faint silhouettes of larger ships in the distance, possibly merchants or pirate vessels, but they avoided contact, slipping into coves or letting the sails slacken until the strangers had passed. Each night, the watchers took turns standing guard near the hold where the White's crate was chained. The creature's rasping, intermittent shrieks had grown weaker, as though it was slowly freezing or decaying even further. But none doubted it would lash out at the slightest opportunity. On the 5th day, a stiff wind out of the north drove them more swiftly, carrying them around the storm-lashed coast near Crackclaw Point. The seas grew rough. Waves slammed the hull, splashing over the rails. Lyanna clutched the rigging, trying not to vomit from the sudden swells. Men hurried to reinforce the lashings on the crate below. The wildling captain cursed under his breath, claiming the gods mocked their quest. Davos barked orders to reef the sail so they wouldn't capsize. Tormund roared in glee whenever the boat lurched, as though half enjoying the chaos. Jon stayed at the helm, face set with determination, knuckles white on the wheel. Late in the afternoon, the storm eased, though the seas remained choppy. The watchers, soaked to the bone, emerged from below to check for damage. The mast had cracked slightly, but Davos thought it would hold if they didn't push it too hard. Lyanna ventured below with Jon to inspect the White. They found the crate battered but still secure, the metal chains intact. A foul stench of rot and brine hung in the hold. The White within hissed. Lyanna wrinkled her nose, stepping back. The living had been lucky yet again. They continued south, creeping past the treacherous waters around Massey's Hook. One night, they glimpsed ominous lights far out to sea, maybe a line of war galleys. Davos commanded they douse their lanterns, drifting quietly in near darkness. Hours later, the lights vanished. Whatever force it was, they had avoided detection. The watchers exhaled with relief, though the tension never left. Finally, the black towers of Dragonstone came into view, visible through a haze of cloud and sea mist. It felt eerily like returning to the lair of an ancient beast. The island's volcanic ridges jutted from the water, and the fortress perched above as if carved by monstrous claws. It was near twilight when they approached the main harbor, which lay in the shadow of basalt walls. Jon and Davos shared a concerned look, uncertain how the Queen would respond to an unscheduled arrival carrying a monstrous cargo. But they had come this far. They had no choice but to attempt a landing. As they drew nearer, horns sounded from the watchtowers, echoing across the black stones. Shapes moved along the battlements. Lyanna felt her pulse quicken, recalling the last time they had entered these waters under tenuous terms. Now they bore a rotting box that might define the fate of Westeros. She took a steadying breath, glancing at Jon. His lips were set in a firm line, determination burning in his eyes. The Maiden's Flood dropped anchor near the fortress quay. Soldiers in Targaryen livery stood arrayed along the docks, spears in hand, the three-headed dragon emblem flickering in torchlight. Lyanna recognized the unsullied, stiff-backed, and disciplined. No sign of Melisandre or Varys in the immediate throng, but she suspected watchers hovered in the wings. She braced herself as the watchers lowered the gangplank. Jon signaled for them to remain calm. Tormund was the first off, leading half the watchers who carefully maneuvered the White's crate down onto the quay. The soldiers recoiled at the stench and the rattling inside. One Unsullied barked an order in a foreign tongue, demanding they halt. Jon and Lyanna stepped forward, arms raised in peace. Davos hovered behind them. "We come at the Queen's invitation," Jon called out. "We have fulfilled our mission. We bring proof of the undead threat." The Unsullied parted slightly, revealing a tall, silver-haired woman stepping forward with regal poise. Daenerys Targaryen herself. She wore a dark leather coat trimmed in red, a cloak pinned by a dragon brooch. A swirl of tension rippled through the watchers. Lyanna exhaled softly. Daenerys's violet eyes flicked from Jon to Lyanna, then to the chained box. "You have returned," the Queen said, her voice quiet but resonant. "And you bring that. I have received ravens from White Harbor, from your friend Lord Manderly, warning of your arrival. I expected you sooner." Jon bowed. "We faced storms and patrols, but we have the proof you wanted." Daenerys's gaze drifted to Lyanna, lingering for a moment. Then the Queen gestured sharply at her guards. "Open a space in the courtyard. I will see this thing with my own eyes." She turned, her expression revealing neither fear nor welcome, only intense curiosity laced with steel. Behind her, two dragons soared overhead, shrieking as if sensing something amiss. Lyanna felt the prick of gooseflesh along her arms. This was it, the demonstration that might unite them or doom them all. They were ushered into the same grand courtyard where they had parted from Daenerys last time. Torches burned bright, illuminating the black stone walls carved with dragon motifs. Rows of Unsullied lined the perimeter. Advisors and soldiers gathered, murmuring in uneasy tones. Lyanna spotted Tyrion Lannister among them, a small man with mismatched eyes and a keen intelligence shining in his gaze. Near him stood Missandei, the Queen's confidant, her expression guarded. Daenerys strode to the center, turning to face Jon. The Watchers, with Tormund and two other strong men, carefully set the crate down. Davos hammered at the nails that sealed the lid. The White inside shrieked, causing some of the onlookers to startle. One guard cursed in a foreign tongue. Jon nodded to Tormund, then turned to Daenerys. "Your Grace, behold the true enemy," he said. He gave a signal and Tormund yanked the crate's lid open. The stench billowed out, causing even some Unsullied to flinch. The White inside, bound in chains, reared up with a hideous screech. Its mouth gaped, eyes blank, skin peeling away in places. Gasps and exclamations rippled through the courtyard. Several onlookers instinctively stepped back. The white thrashed, snapping its teeth. One of its severed arms flopped about, still animate, dragging the chain. A Targaryen guard tried to thrust his spear, but Tyrion motioned him off, wanting to see more. Daenerys's eyes widened. Shock and horror played across her face as the white lunged, nearly toppling the crate. Lyanna saw a momentary flicker of fear. In that instant, the entire crowd realized that the tales of the undead were not mere stories. This rotting, unliving corpse defied every law of nature. The hush was broken only by the white's guttural rasping, the clank of chains. Jon lifted a dragonglass dagger and plunged it into the white's chest. The creature spasmed but did not dissolve entirely. The Watchers wrestled it back, demonstrating that normal weapons had little effect unless carefully targeted. Finally, Tormund applied a second dragonglass blade to the white's neck, and the thing shuddered, going still, decaying into a pile of black dust and rotted limbs. Even the separate arm collapsed in a spasm. A foul odor lingered. Daenerys stared, her hands clenched. The crowd seemed frozen. Some had gone pale. Then the queen slowly approached the remnants. Her posture was tense, as though she expected it to leap up again. When she spoke, her voice carried a faint tremor of shock. "So it is true. Death walks in the north." She lifted her gaze to Jon. "You have risked so much to show me this." Jon let out a long breath. "You demanded proof. We brought it. Now you see why we must unite, why every living soul must stand against this foe. They are countless, and they come for all of us." A murmur spread through Daenerys's advisors. Tyrion looked deeply disturbed, as if re-evaluating all he knew. Missandei's expression was solemn. Even the unsullied, normally unflappable, seemed unsettled by the spectacle. Lyanna could feel the raw tension in the air. This was the moment that might decide everything. Daenerys closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, focusing on Jon. "I believed you exaggerated, but I have never seen such a thing. I have dragons, Lord Snow, but do they hold power against an army of the dead? Perhaps fire can destroy the whites as readily as your dragonglass. Still, it will take more than dragons to fight an entire army." Jon swallowed, stepping toward her. "We need the realm united. Your forces and dragons can turn the tide, but we also need the north, the Riverlands, every kingdom that still can field men. Otherwise, we are doomed." Daenerys's gaze flicked to Lyanna, then back to Jon. "I said I would fight with you if you proved the threat. You have done so. The 7 kingdoms are in chaos, but I will do my part. We shall gather allies and we shall march north. In return, I would have your word on behalf of the north that once this threat is ended, we come together in peace. The Iron Throne must be settled. Will you bend the knee to me, or at least remain neutral if I commit my armies?" A hush fell. Jon clenched his jaw. He had sworn oaths to the Watch, and the North had declared independence under Robb. Yet the realm's survival took precedence over titles. Lyanna's heart pounded, recalling how Ned once bent the knee to Robert for the sake of peace. Would Jon do the same for Daenerys? She watched him struggle internally. At last he spoke. "My first vow is to the Night's Watch, to protect the realm from threats. I have no authority to speak for all the North in terms of fealty, but I can promise that if you march north to fight the dead, I will personally pledge my support and do all I can to bring the North to your side. We cannot face this alone. If we survive, we can speak of the throne. But the living first." Daenerys studied him, then nodded gravely. "Very well, that will suffice. The living first. I will gather my forces. We shall ride for the north or sail to White Harbor, if that is more expedient. Let the living unite." A collective exhale rustled through the courtyard. Lyanna closed her eyes in relief. They had done it. They had convinced the Dragon Queen that the threat was real. Whether Cersei Lannister or the Boltons would see reason remained to be seen, but at least they had dragons on their side. Fire to combat ice. In the flickering torchlight, Daenerys beckoned them closer. "Rest here tonight. We will speak more on the morrow, plan how best to coordinate our armies." I have lost precious time in the war with Cersei, but if the dead cannot be delayed, the living must choose. Some will not heed reason, but we must try." Jon nodded. "Aye, your grace. We thank you." Before the conversation could continue, a roar shook the courtyard. One of Daenerys's dragons swooped overhead, stirring the air in a thunderous gust. The watchers flinched, half ducking. Lyanna felt her hair whip around her face. A swirl of primal awe coursed through her. The Targaryen queen might well hold the key to victory against the undead. Fire and blood, yet used for a just cause if fate allowed. She recalled Rhaegar's dreams, his songs about the coming darkness, the prophecy of the prince who was promised. Perhaps it was bigger than any single figure. It might be all of them, forging alliances that had never existed before. Daenerys turned, her gaze traveling over the watchers, the unsullied, then lingering on Lyanna. A flicker of recognition or curiosity shone in her eyes. For an instant, Lyanna thought the queen might say something about their shared Targaryen connection. If she somehow guessed, but Daenerys only offered a slight incline of her head and said, "You in particular, Lady Lyanna, must have stories to tell. I would hear them one day." With that, she departed, flanked by her guard. The watchers stood in stunned silence for a few beats, the adrenaline of the moment fading. Tormund shook his head as if to clear it. Davos let out a breath he seemed to have been holding all day, and Tyrion Lannister approached to greet them with surprising politeness. Lyanna shared a glance with Jon, who looked as if a great weight had lifted off his shoulders. They had delivered their proof. The queen had pledged to help. It was more than they could have hoped for, though the next steps would be fraught with perils. Convincing the entire realm, traveling north again, leading a combined army against the dead. Still, for the first time in many moons, Lyanna Stark felt a measure of guarded optimism. Their quest had not been in vain. The living might stand a chance. That night, she stood alone on a balcony that overlooked the sea. The moon glimmered on the waves. She thought of the monstrous cargo that now lay in ashes in the courtyard. That one wight had nearly cost them their lives. There were countless more beyond the wall. She shivered, yet they had to try. A quiet footstep sounded behind her, and she turned to see Jon. He joined her at the stone parapet, leaning his elbows on it. The wind flapped his cloak. "We've come so far," he murmured. "From the Tower of Joy to here. If only Father Ned could see us." There was no bitterness in his tone, only reflection. "Sometimes I wish he were here to counsel me." Lyanna placed a hand on his shoulder. "Me too, but you have carried his spirit, his honor through all of this, and we have done what needed doing. The Queen stands with us now." Jon exhaled, tension lining his face. "Yes, and soon we sail or march north again, dragons behind us, to face the greatest danger the world has seen in thousands of years." She nodded, gazing at the dark horizon. "We must stand together. Queen Daenerys, the North, the Riverlands, all of Westeros. And if that unity fails..." She paused, letting the unspoken conclusion hang in the air. "Then the night will devour us," Jon finished softly. "But I will fight until my last breath. I promise you that." Lyanna's grip tightened on the stone. In her mind's eye, she saw a swirl of images. Ned as a boy, Rhaegar singing of prophecies, Robert hammering down Targaryen knights on the trident, baby Jon in her arms at the Tower of Joy, the promise she forced Ned to swear. All had led here. She turned to look at Jon. "I stand with you, my son, to the end." He met her gaze, and in that silent exchange, they renewed the bond that had defied war, secrets, and fate. Together, they looked out at the moonlit sea, thinking of the battles yet to come. The living had gained a champion of fire, but beyond the horizon, the icy darkness loomed, inexorable. Their greatest test lay ahead. Yet on that balcony, side by side, mother and son found a sliver of hope, and sometimes Lyanna thought hope could be enough to tip the balance of the world.